I'm Professor Seth Chandler at the University of Houston Law Center and the Health Law and Policy Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of our participants here to a webinar on the COVID-19 virus and the issues that it poses for the United States, for Texas, and indeed for the world. We've got some very distinguished speakers with us this morning, and what I'd like to do is start off with a brief introduction of why we're here, and provide some resources that you can use to further your education on the COVID-19 virus. I will leave the more technical commentary to the doctors and professionals who follow, but I thought it would be useful to set the framework for why this is an important issue that confronts us. So let me just go through the schedule with you. I will be speaking until 9:30. We'll then have Catherine Weber, an attorney who specializes in employment law, talking about issues for business and employers from 9:30 to 10:15. We'll have Dr. Lisa Strosky-Zeichner, who specializes in epidemiology, who will be speaking about epidemiological and other medical issues from 10:15 to 10:45. We will then have at 10:45 Dr. Umair Shah. Dr. Shah is the chief at the Harris County, that's the county in which Houston is located, public health authority, and therefore he has responsibility for making very serious decisions should the coronavirus spread and become a present problem in this area. We have Dr. Peter Hotez starting at 11:30. Dr. Hotez is a nationally known figure with Baylor, who is an expert on tropical medicine, epidemics, and we certainly welcome his participation. Finally, I know that there's a lot of concern about the virus and its implications for schools. What do you do in terms of with a kid comes in with a runny nose, or the parents have been someplace that seems problematic, or some kid decides that they don't want to go to school because, gosh, there could be COVID-19. And so we have Dr. Catherine Tilney, who's the head of medicine here at the University of Houston, who's going to be speaking to those institutional issues. I will also say this might not be the last webinar we do on the subject. We'll see what things go, but this is what we feel we can cover during today. I will try to reserve about 8 to 10 minutes for question and answers and take that out of the end of each speaker's presentation. So if I cut them off, I'm not being rude, I'm just being rigid and giving you an opportunity to ask questions. You can submit questions through the Q&A component of the Zoom application, or there's also a text box. Those questions will be moderated to make sure that they are sensible, that they're not advertisements for Viagra, profanity, etc. And I will not tolerate that, and will get you kicked out of the webinar. So no profanity, please. If we crash, which is always a possibility, we will get ourselves back up. And finally, I would ask you, participants, I believe you're all doing so anyway, to mute your microphones so that we don't get background noise. So with those ground rules out of the way, why are we here? We're here because we've got 75,282 confirmed cases of COVID-19, mostly in mainland China, significantly on the cruise from hell, but also in other parts of the world. You can also see that as of yesterday, we exceeded 2,000 deaths. You can see that the graph of deaths, that green line, is continuing to increase. If you study it hard, you might see the first derivative declining, the second derivative becoming negative, but it takes a little bit of work. And the key question is, even if it gets controlled in China, which has authoritarian measures that might be difficult to replicate in some other governmental areas, whether we have enough of a seed in Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, the United States, Canada, elsewhere to keep this virus going as we move forwards. But we have a potentially serious problem, not a huge problem outside of China as yet, except for the economic implications, but nonetheless, we have an issue. Why are we here? That is why you're listening to this webinar as opposed to other things. And I'd like to think it's because you recognize that the University of Houston Law Center and its Health Law and Policy Institute has some experience in discussing emerging public health problems. We've had summits in the past on Ebola, on Zika. We have a very useful book that is freely available on the web. It is recently updated. Here's a copy of the paper copy of the old version. The updated version is actually on your screen, and it's freely available, and it is really a very practical guide to what can judges do, what is the law in Texas, somewhat in the United States, with respect to personal control measures such as quarantine and isolation. And I'd certainly like to thank my colleagues over the year, Professor Leah Fowler, April Moreno, Allison Winicky, Ann Kimball, Patty Gray, and many others for their contributions to the creation of what is, in my humble opinion, an extremely valuable resource. It's the kind of book that you never want to pick up and get out of the dust, but you're always very grateful that it exists when you need it. The other sad fact is that Houston and Texas could form an epicenter of any, were COVID-19 to turn into a pandemic rather than sort of its quasi-pandemic, epidemic status that it has now. It's a major port of entry. We will be a resource for the rest of Texas in that we have the largest hospital complex in the United States, and we have a particular issue, which is that we have a high fraction of uninsured patients who may be reluctant to report, undocumented persons who may be reluctant to report, and that will surely complicate any public health response that we might want to make to the virus. So where are we? I think we're in the gray zone between unwarranted optimism and induced panic, and both are mistakes. Excuse me. Too little preparation, and we can find ourselves overwhelmed. People do not always make good decisions under pressure when they're confronting new woes. You can look at the recent experience in China, where we seem to have had a Chernobyl-like pattern of denial. You can look at what appears to be not optimal handling of the situation on the Diamond Princess, and you can realize those people aren't stupid. It's that they are under pressure. They do not have a complete understanding of the situation, and therefore they have a tendency to make decisions which, with the benefit of hindsight, can be very poor. We don't want to ever find ourselves as a society overwhelmed where, you can't get the masks, so the medical professionals won't show up, and then the medical professionals get scared, or they infect people, and then people get scared, and then businesses shut down, and then the economy goes down. People don't trust each other, and I don't have to spell out for you, I'm sure you've all seen all the apocalyptic movies you want, but you can get into a very serious situation, and you can look at, for example, what has China had to do once it let the problem get out of hand. It has had to undertake drastic measures that are going to severely hurt its economy, that are severely hurting people, because the situation, in its view, got out of control. And we would hope that we would never have to replicate something like that here and question whether we have the law enforcement tools and attitudes that would permit it. On the other hand, too much worry is also very dangerous. Franklin Roosevelt said that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Fear has costs. Fear can lead you to avoid people. Fear can hurt the economy, which in turn has its own costs. And I would say that focus on one scary harm can lead us to disregard the others. I did a little research, and more people died of opioid abuse in the United States yesterday than have ever died from COVID-19 in the United States. Indeed, there are 100 times more, you are 100 times more likely to have died from opioid abuse yesterday than to have ever died anywhere except China from COVID-19. Suicides, highway deaths, all of these right now are far more dangerous to us than COVID-19. That equation can change. COVID-19 is scary, but excessive worry is not a ticket to dealing with the problem in an effective way. All right, so we are beginning to get actual data on what is the actual risk of COVID-19. And it appears to depend at least on two significant factors. One is the age of the person contracting the data. And this is from the China CDC. Do I vouch for the complete accuracy of this data? I do not. However, it's probably the best data we have. And so let's take a look. What we see is an important age grading. That is, the disease has fairly low fatality rates for persons under 40. That starts to grow as you get to 60. And unfortunately, for people over the age of 80, of whom there are quite a few in the United States, at least in China, the fatality rate is 14.8%. Now, you might think that a death rate of 0.2% isn't that big, but if you do the math out, as I did this morning, back of the envelope calculations suggest that for the days that you have the disease, your mortality rate as a 30-year-old or a 35-year-old starts to look like that of a 100-year-old. So that 100-year-olds live, right? They live to be 101, but a lot of 100-year-olds die. And so although these fatality rates are low, they are not so negligible that one can feel safe in disregarding them. The other factor that seems to be important in determining your success in fighting off a COVID-19 infection is your pre-existing conditions. And so we see a list of conditions that the Chinese CDC listed here. If you have no pre-existing conditions that they were able to detect, your case fatality rate was only 0.9%, which is not good, but it's better than, for example, if you have cardiovascular disease, in which case it goes to 10.5%, diabetes 7%, hypertension 6%, etc. And so clearly your pre-existing health is going to be a major factor. And what we don't have is sort of the tie-in, like how much of these age-related factors are really just a proxy for pre-existing conditions. And the Chinese government has not released the data in a form that would permit those cross-relationships to be teased out. Perhaps that's something that other researchers might want to push on. But that is why we're here. The other thing I think that is a source of concern is that we do have, at least as of last count, 3,000 health workers who have apparently been infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 in China. This graph, which again is from the Chinese CDC, shows the curve, and you can see, on the one sense, you see a decline, perhaps as personal control measures became more rigorous, perhaps as they started to take precautions. On the other hand, even as we go into here, having this number of suspected plus confirmed cases or clinically diagnosed cases, 80 per day, is quite unnerving. And it does suggest that our medical professionals need to be extremely cautious in dealing with people that they suspect may have COVID-19. And one of the issues I hope our panelists addressed is whether there are any special precautions that healthcare professionals need to be taking. Obviously, they're already confronting infectious diseases, communicable diseases, flu and the like. But given that this virus seems to be a little more vicious than the conventional flu, and it's not quite at measles level in terms of its communicability, it's nonetheless seems to enjoy spreading. Are there things that should be done now, and where are we in that process? All right, so supposing you want further information on the spread of the virus. In our modern world, we are lucky enough to have an awful lot of people working on the problem. And here are some sources. I'm using bit.ly as to reference the link. Bit.ly, if you don't know, is just a URL shortener. And one of the ideas is that some of you, if you want to take down these web addresses and go to them, you can copy this instead of copying the 300 letter long actual URL. This slideshow will be available immediately following this discussion, and I'll provide you the link at the end so that you don't have to be busy scribbling. But if you want to, here it is. In any event, Johns Hopkins is maintaining this daily dashboard. It's available both for desktop products, and there's a mobile version, and it shows you where the infections are taking place. It's got this graphic showing infections, deaths, and recoveries. And it's, I think, a useful source. Plus, if you look in the fine print here, you're going to see sources where you can start to download the actual information yourself if you want to undertake further analysis. The World Health Organization is keeping its own dashboard. You can look at that here. Something called Worldometers, which seems to be a reliable source, has its own dashboard. And the China CDC is keeping its own dashboard, which you can look at. The dashboard is in Mandarin, so that might pose some issue for many, but if you press the translate button on Google, it will attempt a translation. And when I did it, I could sort of make heads or tails out of what they were trying to show. So those are all informational dashboards that might be of use to you. There are also some specialized dashboards that I think are useful. Hong Kong, which is combating the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and is conceivably a new epicenter for it, is maintaining a pretty thorough dashboard, and you can see that here. There's also excellent work being done at a company called Wolfram Research, with which I've had a long relationship, and they've got sort of a number of interesting dashboards, data sets that are in a very friendly, curated form. And so I think it's a good starting point, particularly for those who are familiar with the Wolfram language. But even if not, you can export it into various formats that can be imported into Python or Java or whatever you like. So that's all a very useful information that's available to you. Finally, there's raw data that's available. So Johns Hopkins, you can download the actual counts of how many people died on this day, or that were confirmed sick on this day. Wolfram Research, again, has curated very granular patient data on early victims. That is, evidently, China does not have a HIPAA law, and therefore is willing to put out information on what pre-existing conditions people had, what symptoms they exhibited, did they die, where was it diagnosed, when, and from that you can make all sorts of interesting charts on the progression of the disease. The one downside is, as I looked at this yesterday, the latest data seemed to be from February 7th, which in COVID-19 terms is somewhat ancient history, but it may be that that will be updated shortly. In any event, it's a useful data site for those who want to explore. Finally, the CDC, Center for Disease Control, maintains a lot of guidances. And, if you're not sure what to do, it wouldn't hurt to consult the CDC guidelines. So say you're running a school and you want to know, hey, what am I supposed to do when the kid shows up with a sniffle, or the kid's complaining of fever, or the kid's parents just returned from the Philippines, or the kid's aunt who they stay with actually was in China? What do you do? And so this link will give you the CDC official guidance on what to do right now, or what if you're a healthcare professional, particularly if you're an emergency medical service professional. What can you do? What are your obligations? How can you help yourself? Again, a link right here. What if you're an employer or a business? Now we will hear, our next speaker is Catherine Weber, and she is really an expert and in the trenches on advising businesses about their rights and responsibilities in the face of communicable diseases, particularly COVID-19, as that's the one of interest today. And so I would certainly give her your very careful attention. But also there is a CDC guidance, in which I'm sure Ms. Weber is interested, that excuse me, is available at this website. Finally, there's interesting things like respirators. Apparently, there are not necessarily enough respirators to go around in the event that, hang on, this virus were to unfortunately spread more widely than it is presently. And so the CDC has come up with a plan to optimize the supply of these crucial respirators. All right, so if you're not technically oriented, I found the 3 websites that follow on YouTube to be particularly useful. I am not a doctor, and so it may be that these people have their own axes to grind, or they're not as technically accurate as a doctor would realize, but as sort of a lay intelligent person, I didn't detect signs of insanity on these websites. One is Dr. John Campbell, who has basically a daily broadcast regarding the development of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the associated disease. Another is a website called, or a channel called MedCram. MedCram, I think, is particularly useful in updating people on the status of the disease. And it also discusses potential treatments that people might want to use to deal with the disease or treatments that are online. Finally, the good old Mayo Clinic is maintaining a website that provides a lot of information. And so all of these, it has a podcast, I'm sorry, that I think might be useful for people. So those are YouTube channels for people who like YouTube. All right, scholarly articles. The disease is so new that it's hard to get peer-reviewed scholarly articles, and so you're seeing a lot of preprints out there. One that I did think was particularly interesting was one published in The Lancet. You can see a link to it here. And it speaks about modeling the spread of it. And one of the interesting things that's discussed in that article is the fact that this disease is a little difficult to detect. That is, you can be communicable without being symptomatic, and therefore some of the more conventional methods of screening people may not in fact work. This is going to pose issues for how to deal with border control when we have people who are communicable, but we can't quite figure out who those people are. Anyway, The Lancet is obviously one of the most reputable medical journals in the world, and this is an article that I think people might want to take a look at. So, can't get enough of these webinars? Well, there are 3 more I could commend to you. One is the CDC itself is putting on a webinar tomorrow. Sure, it won't be as good as this one, but still, it is the CDC. And so you can find the link to that here. The University of Maryland, which also maintains a competing health law program, had its webinar. It's a little briefer, but if you want to see another perspective and get further information, that's the link to it. Finally, the Philippine College of Physicians. I thought this one was interesting because it's looking at how what would I call it? Philippines is not a terribly poor country, but nor are they a terribly wealthy country. And they have a lot of traffic with Asia. And so the physicians there are trying to figure out what are we going to do. In fact, they do have had instances of COVID-19 in the Philippines. And so I think you're getting a good on-the-ground perspective in this webinar on how you might want to deal with COVID-19 in a low-resource medical arena. Also, there are meta sites that are sort of like this talk. And we've got, this site has a lot of links to other sites. I can't vouch for the originator as I see, but what I looked at seems sensible. Finally, the China CDC has its own list of reports that it is putting out. Someone is translating those reports actually quite well into English, and so that may be a very valuable source of information from the heart of the current epidemic. Texas, what can you do to educate yourself? Again, immodestly, we have put out this bench book. This bench book has things like, what do you need to do to commit someone to an institution? Here's a flow chart that shows what is the process for quarantine. And so it is basically intended for lawyers and judges about what you can do lawfully to institute personal control measures. It might also be of interest, however, to the general public or to any media sources that are watching to realize the immense power that the public health authorities have in Texas, the governor has in Texas, to take pretty drastic steps in order to protect the health of people here in the event that things were to go south. The Department of State Health Resources also has its own website, which maintains a lot of valuable information on the laws relating to personal control measures. And I would also commend that to people who are interested in Texas-specific law. For those of you who are listening from out of state, we don't have a bench book for you, but you can get a sort of a rough draft. The National Conference of State Legislators has put together a large table that sets forth at least where to find the law in each state regarding things like quarantine, isolation, and things of that nature. And so if you're listening to me from Nebraska and want to know what is the law there, this would be a respectable place to start. Or, frankly, if I were in Nebraska, I would consult the law librarian at the University of Nebraska or another Nebraska law school like Creighton and find out from them how can they help you find out what the law is. Law librarians, in my experience, love to be helpful. There's an organization called Trust for America's Health. I couldn't quite figure out what its axe to grind was, if it had one, And so it seemed fairly reliable, and they're also maintaining a compendium of state laws regarding things such as quarantine, isolation, and how to deal with public health emergencies. You should be aware, people talk about immigration. There are federal laws that do protect the United States against aliens with communicable diseases. It renders those people inadmissible. And then what about people where we don't know they have a communicable disease, but they come from a country or embarked at a place where any of certain diseases are prevalent or epidemic? And under this statute, those people can be detained, and they can be detained until the uncertainty is resolved as to whether they have the disease. That detention, it seems to be about 14 days for COVID-19. And so even if you're not symptomatic, there is some possibility that you could be detained by the Attorney General. And certainly it would not surprise me to see additional restrictions on movement in and out of the country were the virus to become more than a mostly China phenomenon and start spreading to the Philippines, to Nigeria, to France, to other places where we might have a good deal of traffic. Also, there are federal laws relating to quarantines for US citizens. So being a US citizen does not immunize you from the potential for being quarantined. I would call your attention to section 70.6 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which are going to set forth the circumstances under which US citizens can be quarantined. And this particular provision has been dusted off after about 50 years of dormancy and actually used recently to quarantine people. There are also special rules relating to military personnel, and evidently there are orders going out even now about how the military is going to deal with the potential for infection, which could really decimate our troops either domestically or abroad. Legal references, CDC's got a good website. The Congressional Research Service maintains an excellent website. They are generally pretty objective, pretty reliable, and so I would recommend those to you. Finally, for those of you who want to do your own computer modeling, there is a lot of resources available to you. I've picked out a couple of favorite languages here. R has a number of packages that will help you model epidemics. Python has its own packages for helping you model epidemics. The Wolfram Research site has a portal which in turn links to a number of notebooks and packages that will help you model epidemics, including some very interesting work with a package called iGraph. I would recommend that to you. There's a proprietary software which is free as far as I can figure out, called GleanViz, which seems to be very powerful if only I could figure out how it worked. So if you want to make an investment in getting up a learning curve and don't want to do a lot of programming yourself, GleanViz might be the place to go. Finally, we have an interesting master's thesis done at the University of Massachusetts with a link. It looks good to me. Beyond that, I couldn't say. I did not have time to assess it fully. All right, so I'm about to stop here. Probably what you want to know is, how do you get the slides? So here's the link to get the slides that I'm speaking from. So just copy that down or take a screenshot of it. What about the slides that are coming? We will be sending out what we have releases to send out via an email to attendee, and we will also be working on other distribution mechanisms. We will post a recap of the Q&A, and once we have a link to the recording, we will post that on our website and link it to registrants and attendees. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. And I see Catherine Weber there. And at exactly 9:30, which is in 20 seconds, I am going to turn matters over to Catherine. I'm looking at the chat box here, and I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. I'm looking in the Q&A. I don't see any open questions. Perhaps my speech was so wonderful that no one had any, but it's now time to turn to Catherine. So, Catherine, I believe it's yours.
Great, thanks so much. Give me a second. I'll get this up and running and we'll be back in business. All right, here we go. So thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. As Seth said, I'm with Jackson Lewis, and Jackson Lewis is a labor and employment law firm. We're a national firm. We defend employers and managers throughout the country in all matters regarding labor and employment. We have 61 locations across the country with more than 950 attorneys. And because we have 61 locations, we have the innate ability to provide a very national perspective with a very local touch. We're very well connected in each of the legal communities. We know what the bar and what the judges are like in each of the communities. We have intimate knowledge of the laws in those communities. And so again, we bring that national breadth and experience and perspective, but we're able to couple it with a very local touch, which is a wonderful benefit for employers. And we like to tell folks that wherever you are, we are. We've attained national recognition from a variety of different sources. So that's my shameless commercial plug, if you will. And here you can see our map of where our offices are located. So again, we like to tell folks, if you have employees anywhere across the United States, we have offices and attorneys who can assist you. So as the coronavirus was breaking in early January for the United States, we started to get many calls from clients who were rightly concerned with what to do with their employees who were either already in China or their employees who were planning to go to China, either for business reasons or for personal reasons. And as we studied the situation, we quickly recognized that we needed to put together a team, if you will, that would address all of the various labor and employment law issues that go along with helping employers manage this situation and making sure that, number one, that we comply with all the laws that would be applicable, both for purposes of making sure that we assess risks properly and advise properly on how to handle the employees who are away in China or in other parts of travel anywhere for that matter, and for folks who are coming back. But we also had to look at, well, what are the risks and what are our obligations for the employees who are going to be working with these international travelers when they return. So as we looked at all this, we put together a team, and we can identify for you 3 real areas that challenge our employers. And that's, a very broad statement, and it applies regardless of where you are as an employer. The first thing is the international operations and the travel of your employees. The second is potential workplace exposures that might take place to coworkers. And then also many of our employers have direct contact with customers, clients, and the public. So we have to be cognizant, of course, of what steps we need to take to protect our customers, clients, and public from exposure. We also need to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to pandemic planning. So obviously, as a business, we need to be able to operate under all different variety of circumstances. And the coronavirus certainly is a situation that presents a perfect opportunity for employers, if they haven't already done so, to start thinking very, very hard and very quickly about what they will do in the event the coronavirus spreads further in the United States and it begins to impact the employer's ability to conduct business as usual. And we'll get to that a little bit towards the end of this session. So let's start out with what laws, what legal considerations employers have to consider as they're analyzing each particular question or each particular issue related to an employee who has been an international traveler. So let's go through them. So the first thing that we always have to keep in mind is under OSHA, employers have a general duty to provide a safe workplace. We also have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act certainly says that we can't discriminate against folks who have disabilities. It limits what types of questions we can ask and when we can ask them. It limits the ability to make medical examinations, and certainly, again, it prohibits discrimination. When we talk about other federal laws, we look at Title VII. So Title VII prohibits discrimination on a wide variety of bases, including national origin. And certainly that is something that we want to keep our eye on. We want to make sure that as we're stepping through and analyzing each situation, we're not discriminating against people on the basis of a disability or perceived disability. We're not asking unlawful questions under the ADA, but we're also not taking steps that would be discriminatory against individuals and employees because of their national origin, all the while balancing, if you will, our general obligation to provide a safe workplace to our employees. In addition, we have to keep in mind that we have federal, state, and local leave laws, including family and medical leave and paid sick leave laws. And all of those laws may come into play in the event we have an employee who has traveled internationally and come back and found themselves in a situation where either they've been subject to quarantine or alternatively, they've been told that they need to stay at home and monitor for 14 days. We also have the Fair Labor Standards Act and state, local wage and hour laws. And we have to recognize the fact that, you know, it's a wonderful situation if we have employees who perhaps they're asymptomatic, but they need to be out of our workplace for 14 days. It's a wonderful situation if we have the flexibility to allow those employees to work from home, to work remotely. In that situation, then there's no loss in pay. Certainly, times arise, though, where an employee may not be able to work from home. And in that case, we have to consider, well, what do we do in terms of pay? So that's where the Fair Labor Standards Act and our local wage and hour laws come into play. We have to think about the National Labor Relations Act, and the National Labor Relations Act essentially says that employees, whether you've got a union or not, have the right to come together collectively and to engage in what we call group gripe. Okay, all for the sake of each other safety and their job security. So for instance, this may come into play if you have a situation where you've got an employee who's returning from China, the coworkers hear about it and they all come together and they say, look, we just heard that Bob's coming back from China and we're very concerned. And unless you do X, we're not coming to work tomorrow. So those employees would be engaged in what we call collective concerted protected activity. They would be complaining about terms and conditions of employment. And so the National Labor Relations Act would come into play and say, look, employer, you know, you can't terminate those folks because they're coming together and engaging in concerted protected activity with respect to their terms and conditions of employment. We also have the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which prohibits certain types of inquiries into the medical history of family members. We also have individual privacy rights under state laws and common law. And this can get very complicated because, of course, every state has its own state statutes when it comes to privacy. Every state has developed its own common law regarding privacy issues. So we have to make sure that we know what those laws are and know where our employee is working so that we can apply the correct law to our analysis. We also have immigration laws that come into effect as well for folks who need to be making trips internationally and they're unable to do so because of the coronavirus outbreak. So in terms of resources for employers, we like to point employers to these various different pieces that are out there. So OSHA has a piece on the coronavirus. You can see the link there. The CDC is extremely active. You can go to the CDC's website. There's a page devoted to the coronavirus, and there are different pieces of interim guidance that are available for different types of audiences. Certainly, there's a situational update, which is always good to follow. There's guidance for business and employers. There's guidance for travelers. There's guidance for healthcare providers. There are risk assessments that you can look at. The trick with the CDC that we're finding is that they are updating the information almost on a daily basis. And so it's very important that in order to stay up to date, you're checking back and looking at that website each day to make sure that you are familiar with the most recent changes that the CDC has made. There are other pieces of guidance on the CDC website and links to travel alerts and things of that nature. You can find for travelers, you can see CDC's travel notices. You can see Department of State travel advisories. There's also pandemic planning resources available on the EEOC website and also on the Department of Labor's websites. We're starting to see some states publish additional guidance in this time because, you know, obviously we know probably there's more unknowns than there are knowns at this point. So the states are now starting to jump in and starting to publish their own guidance. So certainly if you're an employer in Nebraska, you would want to look and see what guidance, if any, your state has published. So I thought it might be helpful really to explain the various issues that are confronting employers just by collecting all of the questions that we've been getting over the past month or so and putting in some frequently asked questions, if you will. And so I've pulled 10 for you, and we'll go through the considerations that you have to think about in answering each of these questions. If we get through all 10, that's wonderful. If we don't get through all 10, that's fine. This is merely a tool for us to have a discussion. So the first question that we frequently get is, how should employers handle international travel? Well, the first thing, of course, that you have to do is you have to review the travel alerts and the advisories that have been published. So you want to look at the State Department and you want to look at CDC and see what level of warning or alert is currently in place. You also want to review the travel information from the destination country. So if we were planning on sending someone to Taiwan for business reasons, we would want to look and see what kind of travel information Taiwan has issued and what kind of alerts, et cetera, they have issued. We also have to consider the fact that although really most of the focus has been on mainland China, and certainly Hubei has been a big issue, and that's the focus point. But mainland China is really where, you know, we've seen most of the guidance from CDC, but mainland China is not, of course, the only place where we've had instances of the coronavirus. And there are many, many geographical areas that are increasing in terms of their spread of the virus. And so while you might have someone who is coming back from someplace outside of China, you still need to do an assessment and determine, well, where are they coming from? Let me see what that situation looks like in that country and do a risk assessment in terms of whether or not it's appropriate for them to come back into the workplace and immediately go to work, or whether or not we want to consider some sort of a work from home arrangement if that's possible. We absolutely want to tell our employees that if they are sick with symptoms of any sort of an acute respiratory illness, they should not be traveling. And that goes the same for coming to work. I know that we are all, to some extent, workaholics. We're used to working when we don't feel good. That has become the culture in many workplaces, but we need to take a step back and we need to take a break. And if we have employees who are experiencing acute respiratory illness, if they've got fever, if they've got coughing, if they've got difficulty breathing, those employees need to be immediately sent home. And that's regardless of what type of underlying illness it is that's causing the symptoms. We certainly just don't need that kind of spread in the workplace. But it's in particular importance in this time when we have the coronavirus. So also make sure that your employees know what to do and who to contact if they become sick while they're traveling. You want to make sure that you have that communication with the employee. You know, hey, I know I'm sending you to wherever it is. In the event that you become ill while you're traveling, here's what I want you to do. The next question that we get is, well, who presents a risk in the workplace? And this is taken a summary, if you will, from the CDC's website. And this is a chart that you can use to help figure out how much risk, if any, someone presents if they are returning from travel outside the United States. Now, in addition to considering this chart, you also have to consider the reality of your workplace, right? I mean, the reality of your workplace is if I'm, in a cube, by myself and I, work the midnight shift and I never have interaction with my other coworkers, that might be a very different situation than if I'm in a setting where I'm going to have frequent contact throughout the day with my coworkers. So let's take a quick look at the chart and how the CDC categorizes the various risks. So under the high risk category, folks who are assessed at being at high risk for exposure need to be kept away from the workplace for 14 days. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, the reason why we choose 14 days, of course, is because that right now is what is considered to be the incubation period. But a high-risk person is someone who lives with someone who's symptomatic and symptomatic for COVID-19, and they weren't using any sort of defined precautions. Someone who's an intimate partner of someone who is symptomatic with COVID-19 and they're not using defined precautions. Someone who's providing care in a non-healthcare setting for someone who is, again, symptomatic COVID-19 without using defined precautions. And someone who has traveled from Hubei province, China. All of those folks fall into what we call a high risk category. And we want to make sure that we tell those folks that, we're glad you're back, or alternatively, if they're caring someone, for someone, we want to say, look, we know that you're caring for your spouse or your child or your parent. If there's anything that we can do to assist you in that regard, please let us know. But in order to make sure that we don't unwittingly spread this potential risk to others with whom you work, we're going to ask that you work from home for the next 14 days. And so long as you're asymptomatic, certainly we'll be checking in on you. But if you become symptomatic during that 14-day period, we want to hear from you. So please call your manager and let us know. If someone becomes symptomatic while they're staying from home, then we want to look at all those other laws that would apply, right? We want to think about, well, does this person have family medical leave available? Does this person have paid sick leave available? What are my policies? What are my practices in terms of, does the person have paid time off available? All of those things would need to be considered if someone becomes symptomatic in a high risk category. Now then, we also have the medium risk category, and these people too are going to be asked to stay away from the workplace during the 14-day incubation period, except for in those limited circumstances where you assess the risk based on the unique situation in the workplace. So that's the employee who never comes into contact with other workers. So what are we talking about here in terms of our medium risk assessment? We're talking about someone who essentially is living with someone who's symptomatic, but they're using precautionary measures. Someone who's an intimate partner with someone who's symptomatic COVID-19 while using precautionary measures. We're looking at somebody who's providing care in a non-health care setting for someone who's symptomatic with COVID-19, again, while using precautionary measures. And we're looking for folks that have traveled from mainland China and not had any other high-risk exposures. So someone who's returning from mainland China and they don't have any of the exposures that are listed under the high-risk category, we would consider those folks medium risk. We would also make sure that we're thinking about close contacts, okay? So people who have had close contact with someone who's symptomatic with COVID-19 would be a medium risk assessment. And what do we mean by that? Well, essentially, we mean that if you've been within 6 feet for a prolonged period of time, or you've had direct contact with infectious secretions. And while it's not completely clear of all the different ways in which COVID-19 can be spread, we know that at least at this point, the most likely and frequently way that it's spread is through the droplets that are projected when people cough. There's also, if you look at the CDC guidelines, there's a basket of folks who are considered low or no risk. And certainly, just walking past somebody who has, COVID-19, that is not considered a medium or a high risk that would warrant a 14-day incubation period work from home setting. Passing by somebody, being in the same waiting room, not for a long period of time and not within that 6 feet range. All of those things really would not be considered a high or medium risk. But again, we have to consider each employer's specific workplace where that person is going to return to work to ensure that we're taking all the right steps, not only for the coworkers, but also for the clients with whom they come into contact. So the next question that we get often is, so should employees with recent travel to China stay home? And really, the decisions in this area is that if you've come from mainland, certainly if you've come from Hubei, or that's going to be a 14-day work from home or 14-day leave of absence. If you've come from mainland China, that's likely also going to become a 14-day work from home or a 14-day leave of absence. You need to be consistent though. I mean, we don't want to say, well, Larry came back, from this part of China and we're okay if he comes back at this mark, but Susie, she came back from this part of China, and although the situations are similar, it's okay if this person comes back sooner than the other. We really do want to try and be consistent, although again, we have to allow for the fact that we're looking at the unique workplaces of each individual as it will be when they return from their leave of absence or their work from home period. We also have to, we tell folks that, there's so much that is unknown about this virus, and there's so much that is unknown about how the law will develop in this area, that certainly to the extent that you stay within the guidance that's being published by the CDC, that is an area of safety, very low risk. You're doing exactly what the CDC is recommending for employers to do. And so really, that's a very safe, low risk tolerance type of decision to make. Once you start to stray, though, beyond what the CDC is recommending, that's where you get into higher risk decisions. And certainly, most decisions have some amount of risk once you start to stray from the CDC guidelines. So what you have to do really is you have to balance the risk of some potential legal claim against the need to protect your coworkers and the clients or the public that you serve. And you've got to look for a reasonable way to try and balance those risks. Certainly, if we're going beyond the CDC guidelines or guidance, we're doing it because there's a legitimate business reason to do so. We're looking at some sort of a job-related risk, and we're not just making decisions based on fear or allowing, if you will, speculation to run rampant, and therefore we're trying to just keep the workplace quiet, and we don't want to have employees upset. So again, a lot of this is weighing and balancing of risks and the need to protect our coworkers and our clients and the public, depending upon who it is that we're dealing with. The next question that we get often is, what if an employee has a family member at home with COVID-19? And the answer there is pretty simple. You want to go back and you want to look at that CDC risk assessment. And you may have folks that fall either into one category or the other, and you'll need to make a decision based upon what category they fall into and also the work environment that person is going to be returning to or spends their day, if you will. In most situations, we find that employers have been able to find the flexibility to allow work from home. And in that setting, that's the best case scenario, because in work from home settings, we can allow the employee to work from home and continue to receive their same wages while they're doing that. So that's a great situation. If you're not able to do that because of the type of work that the person performs, then you're going to have to think about, wow, what am I going to do in terms of pay? And in terms of pay, that's where we're going to be looking at things like your paid sick leave laws and for your particular jurisdiction. So you may have a jurisdiction that specifically says that, well, you know, in this jurisdiction, you get up to 80 hours of paid sick leave. And you would certainly want to consider that in deciding whether or not to pay the person. My guess is that being told that they have to stay home and they can't work because of COVID-19, that's going to be a paid sick leave type of condition. And certainly some jurisdictions have paid family medical leave. You have family medical leave in itself, which is unpaid, but if there's a paid family medical leave state law statute, that might also get benefits to the employee if they're not able to work from home. You would also, of course, consider whatever your policies are, if you have paid time off or sick time or vacation that you want to allow employees to use. Some employers actually are not requiring their employees to use up their PTO or their vacation time because they want to make sure that they are motivating employees to take the right steps in terms of if they're sick, they're staying home. If they can't work, they're not working, and they're not tapping onto their sick leave or their vacation, and they're just allowing that person to take the time off with pay. That's not to say that that's legal.
Could I interject a question here?
Sure.
Okay, so I just want to get some clarification because it was something I was going to ask you anyway. So this issue of whether you have to pay people
Right.
who are, you've asked them to either work at home or in some instances you just not work because they can't do the work from home. Whether you have to pay them depends on mostly state law. Is that fair?
That's correct. So there's nothing under the Fair Labor Standards Act that says that you have to pay somebody who's not working. Now, the only exception is if you have an exempt employee. If you have an exempt employee and they perform any work during the work week, then you are going to have to pay that person in most situations the entire salary for that work week. Now, if you have a paid time off policy or a sick policy that provides a reasonable amount of time off work, you can certainly have that salaried employee draw down on that paid time off bank, but that exempt employee, if they perform any work during the work week, they're going to be paid for that work week. Now, if you have someone who's not exempt, then they only have to be paid for the hours that they work. And in terms of leave laws, there is no federal law that requires paid time off in this circumstance, unless, of course, you know, perhaps you work for the government, right? And you're looking at paid family medical leave. But family medical leave is unpaid. Employers may have a short-term disability policy that an employee may be able to get benefits from while they're otherwise on an unpaid leave of absence. But family medical leave is unpaid, and accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act is unpaid. So you are back down now to the state law level. And the question is there a paid family medical leave state statute? Is there a paid sick leave statute that would apply, that would provide the employee pay while they're not working?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry for the interjection, but it just occurred.
Sure, no problem.
Time to ask.
Nope. Next question that we frequently get, well, there you go. Do employers have to pay? and we've covered that. So you read my mind. We're all on the same book and page. That's great. So next question, what steps should employers require before allowing employees to return to work? So this is a tricky one, right? So the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, well, did the person spend time in mainland China? Did the person spend time in Hubei province? Those are the first two questions, right? Because they're going to form the basis for our risk assessment. Has the employee experienced any symptoms while they were either in China or while they were off work. And by symptoms, what I'm talking about is, have they had a fever? Have they had a cough? Have they had difficulty breathing? Any of those things plus travel to China is going to raise, the likelihood that the employer is going to ask for some sort of a return to work note. You're also going to look at the workplace again that they're returning to. Again, that clerk in the department where the clerk doesn't have any exposure to other employees, maybe that's not somebody who's going to have to bring in a workplace return to work note from a doctor. Now, it's important that you also look at your policies, right? Because your policies may say any employee who's been off work for 3 days and it's not family and medical leave has to bring in a doctor's note. We want to look at those as well. But again, under these uncommon times, certainly employers might choose to say, look, we're going to suspend normal practices in this regard, and we're going to handle the situation in this fashion. Now, the CDC recommends that the employer community not require employees to present a doctor's note in order to return to work because they fear that medical facilities will be overwhelmed. That's not the same as saying that it's unlawful, because it's not unlawful to ask for a doctor's note. But the CDC is certainly concerned that if all of the employers start saying to all of their employees who stayed home for 14 days that they have to bring in a doctor's note, that it will be tough for the doctor's offices to be able to sustain that kind of flow. So whether or not you ask for a doctor's note, it really is a risk tolerance type of issue. And, in most cases, we just look at the workplace. We look at whether or not the person had any symptoms. And perhaps if they were asymptomatic and, for the entire 14 days that they worked from home or that they were off work, perhaps that's the setting where we go, you know what, we don't need a doctor's note, but instead what we'd like for you to do is we need for you to confirm for us that you haven't had any of these following symptoms during the time period that you've been off work. Again, this is a very unique situation and it's handled differently for each employer, and it's based upon all the risks and all the different factors that we've discussed. So what if the employee has actually contracted COVID-19? Well, certainly we're going to communicate with the state and local health department. We're going to do that immediately. We're going to follow the directions of the CDC and the state and the local health department. Now, if the employee was at work while they were infected, the CDC says that we need to make sure that the employees with whom they came into contact with are informed, but at the same time, we have to protect the confidentiality of the infected employee's information. So think about the Americans with Disabilities Act and Family Medical Leave, that say that you have to maintain the confidentiality of a person's medical information. So we would want to let the coworkers who are potentially exposed know, but we would not reveal who it was so that we can protect the confidentiality and the privacy of the person who's fallen ill. So what if the employee or the customer, the client, is confirmed to have COVID after being in our workplace? Again, you're going to follow largely the same type of analysis. You're going to talk to your state and local health department. You're going to follow directions regarding disinfecting, and it's good to know that the folks at OSHA don't think that there's anything special. You don't need any special cleaning products, just use regular disinfectants. Then you're going to work with the CDC and the state and local health department to identify potential contacts. You're going to perform a risk assessment on your employees who came into close contact, or any contact, quite frankly, with the infected customer or client. And you're going to do a risk assessment in terms of, well, so Mary was cleaning the hotel room of George, our patron, who stayed here last night and has since been confirmed as COVID-19. We're going to do a risk assessment on Mary to decide, what should Mary do? Should Mary now be asked to step away from the workplace for 14 days and monitor symptoms so that she can protect her coworkers from the spread of the virus? So that is a very unique situation. It is very much tethered to the workplace and the particular positions that came into contact with the client or the customer. We again are going to make sure that we're managing confidentiality concerns. You'll probably have a PR issue that you'll need to be prepared to handle. And then you're going to have to think about, well, if 20 of my employees came into contact with George, I'm going to need to figure out what my plan is to fill those 20 absent slots if all 20 of those folks need to stay at home for 14 days. All right, so what kind of steps should people be taking right now? Well, certainly, you know, this is flu season and we should be telling our employees, if you're sick, stay home, right? Emphasize that. And I know that in some workplaces that can be countercultural, but we really, really need to make sure that that message gets out, that we want you to stay home if you're sick. If you are in the office and you're sneezing or you're coughing, you need to use proper respiratory etiquette. We're going to be doing more routine environmental cleanings. And if one of your employees has a sick family member at home with COVID-19, we want to make sure that we tell that employee, look, you need to let us know that. All of our employees should know, look, if one of your family members comes down with COVID-19, you need to let HR know, right? And we need to just take a moment to try and plan for that potential outbreak. And what does that planning look like? Well, you need to be able to continue to operate your business, right? So Jackson Lewis needs to continue to be able to operate even if, you know, one half of its attorneys are unable to come to work. Fortunately for us, if we're asymptomatic and we're, you know, we are able to work, we're all set up and we're going to be working from home. But of course, if we come down with symptoms, then we're not going to be working, right? So we're, you know, our workload is going to have to be balanced out among the other employees, the other attorneys here that we all work with. And that's the same type of analysis that any other employer would have to go through. So the employers, you know, no matter what the industry, you know, you've got to think about. Take the moment now to think about what will you do to reduce the transmission among your staff? What will you do to protect those employees who are at higher risk? What will you do to maintain business operations? We're not going to close, right, if we can avoid it. What are we going to do to minimize the adverse impact on the people that we deal with? How will we prepare for those increased absences? Are all of our employees set up so that they can work from home in positions where that's appropriate? How will we communicate with our employees, right? All of those things are items that you should put on your list to do now, because once you have an increased outbreak within the United States, you'll have, you know, that time will become your enemy, right?
So Catherine, if I could interject, that's my question. So right now, we don't have today a COVID-19 problem in the United States.
That's right.
And so you're asking people to spend an hour, 2 hours thinking about things that they would prefer not to think about.
Absolutely.
When they could be doing their daily business and billing their clients and building their widgets. But it's your sense that there's enough of a risk here and that there's going to be a problem trying to do this at the last minute, that if you're a small business, a big business, you ought to be spending some time in the next week or so trying to figure this out. Is that fair?
That's a fair statement, because the benefit of doing the planning now outweighs the loss of the value of your time, the loss of building that one more widget, the loss of billing that one more hour. It really is a worthwhile endeavor, and doing it at the last minute. Every plan is going to have failure points, but if you take the time now, you'll reduce the likelihood that you'll have a situation where you won't be able to build widgets, where you won't be able to serve your clients. All right, so for all employers, you know, everybody wants to stay up to date, and you've provided all kinds of information regarding COVID-19 and places where you can go to find more information and to stay up to date. We at Jackson Lewis have a disability leave and health management team, and we've been following COVID-19 since its inception here. We've been publishing blogs and articles that stay up to date and try to summarize and give recommendations recommendations each time we see one of the agencies produce some additional guidance. So you can see that we have 3 articles that we've published online, and certainly the next time that CDC or OSHA or any of the agencies produce something that's relevant to the employer community, you can bet that we'll have a blog or an article piece up giving recommendations to clients and summarizing the information for clients so that they can stay up to date and can make good decisions.
All right. Catherine, thank you very much. Let me ask you to stay on for a few questions that have been posed both by some of our listeners and then some that have occurred to me during the course of your talk. One question is posed as to supposing a university has graduate students and those graduate students are employed. I assume the doctrines that you spoke of earlier apply to that employment relationship the same as to conventional employment relationships?
If they're an employee, then yes.
Okay. All right. And then if, suppose for whatever reason, your firm is busy, your firm is conflicted out, whatever, what type of lawyer would handle the kind of issues that you're raising? I take it wouldn't be the person who did your divorce or a criminal law attorney. Who should people be seeking out?
Right. So this is an area where the attorney has to be steeped in labor and employment law, right? Because you saw that big list of different statutes that come into play. And what it really requires is a law firm or a lawyer that has deep expertise in labor and employment law. That means it's not the person who handled your wills and trusts. It's not the person who you go to for medical malpractice. It is someone who practices and has a nice, deep, broad understanding of all the various federal and state labor and employment laws that come into play in this arena, because you've got to analyze all of those laws in each situation. And it largely is teasing out, if you will, what laws apply and what are the risks if you do A, B, or C, and what are the benefits.
Let me come to one question. When I teach law students, I often tell them when looking at a law to always ask the question, but what if you don't? And so you had a lovely chart in your slide about what employers should be doing to screen employees and maybe put them at home. And so as perhaps extra inducement to get people to do this planning now, can you outline for us what happens if an employer fails to take sensible precautions in dealing with a risk such as COVID-19 and some of their employees get sick or potentially die as a result?
Sure. So if you have a situation where, let's say, Larry is coming back from China and he says, hey, wink, wink, you don't tell anybody, I won't tell anybody, I'll just come on back in, right? And Larry, maybe he's an asymptomatic carrier, right? I mean, because we know that there are folks who are asymptomatic, but yet are able to pass the virus on to other people. So we go, yeah, Larry, you're really a valuable player and I want you to come back to work. And so Larry comes back to work and maybe later he gets sick, or maybe he doesn't, maybe he remains asymptomatic, but others around him are infected by Larry. So what we've got there certainly is a situation where, you've got a potential OSHA issue, because if we think about it under OSHA, we have a general duty, right, to provide a safe workplace for all of our employees. If somebody, becomes ill because they were exposed to COVID-19 on the job, then you've got a workers' comp exposure, right? So workers' comp is going to kick in there, and the employee's remedies are going to be limited by the workers' comp statute. So that employee is not going to be able to bring a claim against the employer and say, pay me, $500,000 because you unreasonably exposed me to this risk. Their remedies are going to be limited to the workers' comp statute. However, if you take that one step farther, and Mary, who got exposed and became ill, and she was taking care of her 4 kids and her elderly mother who was going through chemotherapy, she goes home not realizing she's been exposed. She cares for those folks, and then all come down with the COVID-19. Those other outsiders, the non-employees, they're not covered by workers' comp. So those employees, I mean, if you kind of follow the chain, they might have some sort of a claim against the company for not taking reasonable steps. And certainly we have issues with the public. We want to make sure that, you know, for employers who have the situation where they're customer facing, right? You know, they're serving your food, they're in your workspaces, they're meeting with you on a regular basis. We need to be taking reasonable steps to protect those people as well. So, you know, there are all different types of things that come up and all different types of angles that you have to look at. But in no case do we want to turn a blind eye to that kind of medium or high risk situation and end up exposing one of our workers or some, you know, client or customer or a family member to that kind of risk.
So putting apart any moral obligations, a business that cares about its financial health ought to be undertaking those unpleasant steps that you outlined in the slide, going through its plans, figuring out what it's going to do, keeping current, not just because it's the right thing to do, although that would certainly be a start, but also because there is potential serious liability under OSHA, under workers' comp rule, and potentially under state tort law if third parties become injured, where the damages could be extremely high. And then the other thing they might want to do is start looking, if it's a large company, it has a risk management department, start looking at what sort of insurance coverages they have in the event that we see consequences from an outbreak. Would that be fair?
That would be fair.
Okay. I've got one other question for you as we wait for our next speaker, which is, what if the employee just feels that it's too dangerous? They work for McDonald's at Central and they're being asked to go to Hong Kong to check on Hong Kong operations. And they see, oh, Hong Kong's got an issue. I'm just too nervous. I've got kids at home. Can that employee refuse to go? And can their employer impose consequences on that employee for such an action?
Well, certainly, you know, this is very much akin to the situation where the employee wants to wear the face mask at work, right? They don't want to travel to Hong Kong. They want to wear the face mask at work. And it's really about risk assessment, right? So in the situation where we look at what CDC says, and CDC says it's okay for him to go to Hong Kong, or here's the travel alert level, but we think it's okay for him to go to Hong Kong. I question, you know, I mean, really, do we want him to go to Hong Kong, right? I mean, is that really a good move for us? But if we do, and we've done our risk assessment, and if we conclude that, you know, look, CDC is telling us that it's okay for you to go to Hong Kong or wherever, to Canada, you know, if we do that risk assessment and the person says, but I'm just so nervous, I don't want to travel, the employee doesn't have the right to object, right? Certainly, most employers in that setting are going to try and work with the employee. And the employee may come back, though, and say, well, I have an underlying health condition. And because of my underlying health condition, I need a reasonable accommodation. And my reasonable accommodation is that I've got this doctor's note that says that I shouldn't travel to these areas because of the high risk of exposure to COVID.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to have to cut you off with, which was an extremely helpful answer. We don't have applause on this webinar as far as I can figure out, but if we did have a clap feature, I am confident there would be an awful lot of people clapping right now for a very helpful presentation. What I'm now going to do is to attempt to use the Zoom app to end you and to get us to Dr. Louisa Ostrowski-Zeichner, who's going to be speaking to us about medical issues relating to the COVID-19 disease and SARS-CoV-2 virus. So thank you very much. And I'm muting you. And I am somehow going to take control of the screen. So we're going to stop your sharing and we're going to go to Dr. Ostrowski. There you are. And Dr. Ostrowski, the floor is yours. I'd welcome you sharing your screen if that's what you intend to do. or just otherwise speaking and telling us your views.
Good morning. Setting up my access for
And
the
possibly if you could somehow turn your mic up, that might help a little bit. You're a little soft.
Okay, can I
That's
can
better.
you see my screen?
Yes. Mhm.
Can you see my screen?
We cannot yet see your screen. I just see you and your office. There should be a little button at the bottom that says share screen. It's sometimes on the top.
It says screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later.
Okay. So let me see if there's something that I'm doing here that is obstructing your screen sharing. Okay. Let's try it now. I think you succeeded. Great.
Perfect.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Louis Ostrowski. I'm a professor of infectious diseases here at McGovern Medical School, and I'm also a associate professor of epidemiology at the University of Texas School of Public Health. And I wanted to go over some of the epidemiological aspects of this coronavirus 19 outbreak. And I'm going to start with a little bit of history, the first time we encountered coronavirus here in Houston. So this is one night at the emergency room in Herman Hospital, spring 2003. We had a patient that presented. He was a 47-year-old white male with shortness of breath. He was a truck driver for a Canadian company. He's really sick. His O2 sats, his saturation of oxygen in the blood is 88%. He has diffuse changes in the x-ray, and he tells us there's something going around back in Canada. This something ended up being SARS. This patient fortunately didn't have this disease, but it really sort of opened the door for us to think that we are living in a global world, and that things that are happening in Canada or in Hong Kong or in China are definitely going to be affecting us here in Houston. So 2003, SARS was the epidemic that started to spread through the world. This is some of the magazine covers that we had back then. And it really was dominating the sort of the thinking, the healthcare settings, and all of the news cycles as well. Why was this such a big deal? You can see here, this was an epidemic that started in Hong Kong from a patient that came from the Guangdong province in China, and it rapidly started to accumulate hundreds of cases in this major metropolitan area. This is one of the most well-described epidemics in contemporary history. And as you can see here, we had the index case was a patient from Guangdong province in China. This was somebody who was in contact with wildlife, who went to Hong Kong and stayed in the Hotel Metropole. And this hotel became ground zero for infecting what we call seeds that went on and carried the disease to several other countries. So from one hotel, we could trace cases to Vietnam, Singapore, the United States, Ireland, and Canada. And again, it very quickly became a worldwide issue that we had concerns about. This is a floor map of the Metropole Hotel where this started. And as you can see here, in this color, this is the original patient's room in the hotel. And in this other teal color, we can see all the other patients that got infected and subsequently went and seeded the infection in the different countries. And in this red shapes, we have surfaces that tested positive for SARS coronavirus. So this was really not going through the air system, but it was actually going through contaminated surfaces in the elevator lobby, door handles, etc. Very quickly, this became a widespread outbreak in a particular neighborhood in Hong Kong called Amoy Gardens, where this neighborhood basically had to be segregated from the rest of the city. Everything was shut down. You can pretty much imagine what you're seeing in the news cycles today about what's happening in Hubei and other provinces in China, happening in Hong Kong in this very densely populated neighborhood. Again, I was telling you, this is one of the better studied outbreaks in sort of contemporary medicine. And we have very elegant epidemiology that allows you to see how one patient that arrived in Singapore has a wave of infections that are immediate close contacts to them. He starts another seed here that, again, has a wave of infections, and so on and so forth. So this is how coronaviruses tend to spread very easily from person to person through respiratory droplets. The outbreak eventually reached Canada, where again it reached epidemic proportions. And this is very interesting to see, and when people ask me about it, how long is this going to last? This is what happened in Toronto, where there was sustained transmission of this infection. There was a biphasic curve here where you can see a large number of cases occurring over the course of a month, month and a half, then a lull, and then we had another spike of cases. And very importantly, this was an outbreak that affected predominantly hospitals. So there was in-hospital transmission of this disease, with many healthcare workers being affected, such as we're hearing from the news and some of the medical literature that's happening in China right now. Again, in Toronto, we experienced severe healthcare worker transmission, hospital shutdowns, and eventually they requested emergency assistance from some of our infectious diseases and hospital epidemiology agencies here in the United States. We ended up creating SARS wards or SARS hospitals. So we very quickly realized that we shouldn't have all these patients sort of strewn out through the hospital. They would be better served in a specific unit, and everybody going into that unit would be wearing protective equipment. So this is one of the big lessons from the Toronto outbreak. The second big lesson is that despite having this SARS wars and sort of practicing precautions, there was still transmission in the hospitals, and they quickly realized that it wasn't really the patients that were transmitting the infection in the hospital, because they were very well contained. People were wearing protective equipment when caring for them. It was the visitors, because the visitors had the exact same exposures as the patient, and they were still okay, and they were sort of visiting and touching the elevator and going to the cafeteria, and that's where the transmission in the hospital was occurring. So as a result of this outbreak, we sort of came up with very strict rules about visitation for patients with infectious outbreaks. Going on with other outbreaks, we have avian influenza 2005. This really rang the alarm for influenza epidemics that could be related to sort of avian host, have little outbreaks in China that could spread, that could end up having major outbreaks throughout the world, because none of us are immune to this type of avian influenza. And this really sort of came to fruition and reality in 2009, when we experienced a worldwide outbreak of H1N1 swine flu. Again, this started in China, very quickly spread through the world, eventually reached Mexico, from Mexico to the United States. And this really changed the way we operate in healthcare settings. This is the first time we saw in our lifetimes screening in the airports, temperature checks, sort of screening when you go into the hospital. They're asking you, did you travel to China or to Mexico? And having sort of triage areas outside of clinical settings. So this really said, this is a reality for all of us. We need to start working on ways to contain this potential worldwide pandemics. The latest coronavirus we had seen before this new epidemic is called MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, another disease caused by coronavirus. This was predominantly happening in the Middle East, in the map that you see there. And very interestingly, it really never left the Middle East. We had isolated cases in Europe, isolated cases in the United States, but we never really had the transmission that we were hearing about in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, etc. Here in the United States, we evaluate a person of interest for MERS every other month or so, and so far, as far as I'm aware, we haven't really seen any MERS in the Houston area. What have we learned from a healthcare setting regarding all these outbreaks? We have created a pandemic response plan, and we sort of adapted to new information and new bugs that are coming out every few years. We continuously monitor epidemiological situations throughout the world and adjust our pandemic response plan according to the information that's coming here. We quickly learned that the worst thing you can do when you're having an outbreak is run down the hallways and scream and have an uncoordinated response. So we learned that when we have an outbreak, we need to go to a sort of a emergency management model where there's a command center, there's incident commanders, experts that provide, you know, content and context to the managers, etc. So we've gone to this outbreak response program model. We have screening algorithms for different diseases in our emergency centers, transfer centers, international office, all points of entry to the hospital like labor and delivery, admission, day surgery, etc. And these algorithms can be quickly tailored to the disease du jour. So right now it's coronavirus 19, but as we discussed, it's been MERS, it's been SARS, it's been pandemic flu. We communicate with our staff and continuously update them with what's going on throughout the world. And now we have a lot of electronic technology where we can have screening in the electronic medical records, order sets, alerts, automatic isolation orders. So we are using technology in the hospital to do this. We've learned that we are not operating alone. We need to work as a system, healthcare system. You have to have contingency plans in case you have massive numbers of cases. We learn to sort of manage our protective equipment because undoubtedly anytime there's an outbreak situation, there's a runoff for supplies, not only in the healthcare setting, but in the consumer setting. And we also work on guidelines for infection control in ancillary services. So things you never think about, but things like cleaning, nutrition, laboratory, what do you do if a patient needs to have a CAT scan, security, OR, etc. And again, we spend a lot of time working on communications, and we have been doing drills for the past few years as to what happens if we have a patient that shows up with Ebola, with avian flu, etc. Now to go into some of the deeper epidemiological aspects of this infection, I want to really make the distinction here. The virus has been named SARS coronavirus 2, according to international naming conventions. And the disease caused by this virus is called coronavirus disease 19. So this is why you sometimes see two different names in the lay press or the literature. So SARS coronavirus 2 is a virus, coronavirus disease 19 is the name of the disease. Coronaviruses are a large family of viruses that are very common in many different species of animals. Coronavirus actually is one of the most common causes of the common cold in humans. But there are some zoonotic coronaviruses, mainly being the beta coronaviruses, that normally affect humans, and when they make a jump, species jump to us, that's when we have large numbers of population that don't have immunity to these diseases, and there's transmission and there's increased lethality. And this is exactly what happened with SARS 2003, MERS 2014, and now with COVID-19, as we're seeing in China and the rest of the world. This virus was first detected in the city of Wuhan in China in early December. Wuhan is a major metropolitan area, 11 million people. It's a transportation and connection hub for all of China. And the initial cases of this disease were linked to people that shopped or worked in a wet market. This is the common term used for markets that sell a lot of wildlife. And this initially prompted us to think that there was animal-to-person spread. But eventually we started to hear about cases being spread person to person with no contact to this wet market. And that's when we realized that this disease has a person-to-person spread, and it's not exclusively a zoonotic disease. Cases are being reported now in many, many countries. I checked the count today. We're up to 74,000 cases worldwide with 2,009 deaths. The vast majority of cases are in China, about 99% of the cases actually. And very interestingly, as we're going to discuss a little bit down the line, the second number of highest cases in the world is in a cruise ship that's anchored off of Japan. In the United States, we've had a handful of positive cases. As of yesterday, we had 15 cases. It is very important to emphasize that there's very little transmission of cases in the United States. All of the cases we've had, but 2 are imported from the Wuhan region in China. The 2 that have transmitted locally have been close family members of this other 13 cases. So not completely unexpected. Very importantly, there's no widespread or any kind of transmission within the United States. Very importantly, in this map, you're going to see that Texas is now highlighted as having cases. These are the cases that have been brought over from Wuhan, evacuees under quarantine in the San Antonio military base. So we have no community cases of coronavirus 19 here in Texas. Where does SARS coronavirus 2 rank according to transmissibility and mortality? This is a very nice graph I took from the New York Times. On the bottom, you can see the average number of people that would get sick when exposed to one case. This is a very important number we call the R0 in epidemiology. And again, it tells you how many cases you expect to see for every patient you diagnose. And we think that the R0 for coronavirus 2 is going to be somewhere between 2 and 3. And you can see here how it ranks with other diseases you're very familiar with. Mortality-wise, we see about 10% mortality. And again, you can see where it ranks with compared to MERS, bird flu, Ebola, the Spanish flu, etc. So this pink area is where we expect coronavirus to fall according to transmissibility and mortality. So a lot less transmissible than measles, chickenpox, perhaps more than the common cold, and a lot less lethal than MERS and SARS, but similar to what we see with H1N1. So,
Dr. Ostrowski, could I interject with a question here?
Absolutely.
If we were to put this diagram in 3 dimensions, and we were to add ability of the virus to spread before symptoms become obvious, before they become testable, my sense is that that's the unique feature, or the peculiar feature of this virus, is that it apparently can spread before anyone realizes they have it. Is that unusual? Is that actually fairly common? How would you assess SARS-CoV-2 on that scale?
So I'm going to address that in a slide that's coming up, but Perfect. I'd like to say that
okay, great.
Yeah, we think that it may be transmitted before you're symptomatic, which would be a game changer, because maybe that's what explains why it's so much transmissible than SARS and MERS. But we don't have that level of information to make that assessment at this time. And I'm going to show you why. Just to put things under perspective, this is again from the New York Times. How does Wuhan coronavirus or coronavirus 2 compared to SARS? This is a graph of the SARS epidemic over time, and you can see how this is dramatically different. There's a whole lot more spread of coronavirus 2 when compared to the SARS coronavirus. The worst epidemiological situation ever is happening off of the coast of Japan. all of you have read about the Diamond Princess. This is a cruise that had a few people infected, and the Japanese government elected to not let the patients disembark. They kept them in the cruise, sort of screening them, isolating them in their rooms. When you had a patient that was coronavirus positive, they would let them off the ship. And unfortunately, this is kind of the worst situation you want to be in, with having a highly infectious agent in very close quarters. And we all have heard before about outbreaks in cruises with norovirus and other viral illnesses. It's gotten to the point where, hundreds of patients are infected in this cruise. Last update I read was about 400. And we are starting to see now countries evacuating their citizens from here. And then yesterday we heard that the Japanese government finally allowed people to disembark, people that tested negative for coronavirus. But this again has been questioned by public health authorities, because we don't know if some of them are still in incubation period, because there's been cases as recently as the day before. So very complex situation. I really don't envy the decision makers for this cruise issue. We ask about transmission before you're symptomatic. This is a New England Journal of Medicine paper published a couple of weeks ago that claimed to prove that people could spread the disease before they were symptomatic. This was an index patient that visited Germany. She was asymptomatic, attending business meetings, left, and right when she got back home, she had symptoms immediately, basically during the flight. So in this time frame, she was thought to be asymptomatic. She attended business meetings with these other people, and then we had a cluster of cases in Germany. So everybody says this is the smoking gun, that you can transmit disease before you're symptomatic. However, a retraction for this paper has been issued. They actually asked the index patient if she was really asymptomatic when she was here, and she conceded, and she said that she wasn't feeling quite well, and she was taking antipyretics in this time frame. So again, we hear from the Chinese ministry that they have data showing that you can transmit the disease when you're asymptomatic, but Western countries have not seen this data. So something to be determined yet. This is the screening algorithm we use in healthcare settings. We ask if the patient has traveled to China or has been in close contact with a known coronavirus person. If the person has fever or symptoms, we isolate. Then we sort of verify that they actually have fever and respiratory symptoms. And if they do, we send for testing. And the patient does not necessarily need to be hospitalized. If they're not meeting criteria for hospitalization because they're requiring any support, they can go home, be on home isolation with certain guidance we give them. If the patient actually needs to be hospitalized, we put them under special precautions in the hospital. What are the knowns and the unknowns for this disease?
Can I interject again?
Yeah.
The person reports that they've been to a country other than China where there's some modest incidence of COVID-19, such as Malaysia or the Philippines or Hong Kong. Would they even enter into this protocol, or would they just not be treated as posing much of a risk?
Not at this time. At this time, the CDC is only going with China or close contacts with known cases. They wouldn't even let us test anybody that doesn't meet this algorithm. So,
and do you feel that that leaves us excessively vulnerable given that the virus has spread?
I think there's a vulnerability, but I understand why they do it. There's a need to triage the volume of testing at this point. But I expect this to be rapidly changing as we start seeing sustained transmission in other areas. They may add them to this algorithm.
Thank you.
Knowns for this disease, we know that it can transmit person to person through droplets. We know that it's not airborne. It's not something floating around in the air ducts. We know the incubation period, which is between 2 to 14 days. We know that 90% of people present with fever, and we know that mortality is associated with underlying comorbidities. So the vast majority of people do very well with this disease. 80% of them don't require any sort of care or hospitalization. 20% of people will. And of this, 90% of them are male, over 60 years of age, and with heart or other medical conditions. What we don't know about this outbreak is the exact source and timing. There's some controversy as to whether there was transmission before December or not. We still don't know where exactly this virus came from. We know it has some sequences that are compatible with bat viruses. There's other intermediate hosts that have been proposed, like snakes and pangolins, but we don't know yet. We don't know how long it can survive in surfaces. People have shown about 9 days is the maximum it can do. There's some issues about the true number of cases. We feel that there's maybe some underreporting. We don't, again, know exactly the R0 for this virus, see how infectious it is. We don't know if you have the potential for being contagious before the symptoms. We don't have a specific treatment. We don't know if a pregnant mother can transmit it to the baby through the placenta at this point. And very interesting, we don't know why it rarely affects children and why they do so well. Some common myths and urban legends that I want to address are listed here on the left side of the slide. There's all sorts of viral rumors online that we do a lot of work trying to contain, like packages from China can transmit the virus. Again, we don't think it can survive long periods of time in surfaces. We have never heard of a patient being acquiring the virus this way. Pets can be reservoirs, completely false.
And Dr. Ostrowski, I'm going to need to ask you to take one more minute to finish up. We've got Dr. Shah on, and I'm trying to keep to a schedule. So
perfect.
It's been fantastic, but if you could wrap up, that would be great.
Excellent. Again, you can see all of this rumors on the left side. The one that I do want to address, there's this huge conspiracy theory about this virus being a bioweapon that escaped from a lab in Wuhan, and that's being perpetrated by some Twitter channels, conspiracy theory websites. This is absolutely not truth. It has nothing to do with bioweapons, and it didn't escape from a lab. What are we doing as a country? We're having a very high level of travel to China. We're repatriating and quarantining our citizens, and we're actively screening people in the airports, not letting non-US citizens in, and quarantining voluntarily the US citizens that are coming back. From an infection control standpoint, we ask patients to wear a surgical mask. Healthcare workers can protect themselves by using contact precautions, airborne precautions, and eye protection. And we are in deep communication with the Department of Health for testing. Number one thing you can do to avoid infection with coronavirus 2 is to wash your hand. I found this little sign in a cute little shop, and this is Texas. So wash your hands and say your prayers, because Jesus and germs are everywhere. This is my life motto. What to expect? We expect increasing number of cases. We will see person-to-person transmission in the United States eventually. We will understand this disease and the transmission better. And if we go to the SARS and MERS model, I think this outbreak will last a few months, but it has the potential to become endemic or seasonal through the United States and all over the world. This is my last slide. I want to thank you for your attention, and I am on Twitter, and I'll be happy to answer any questions there. Thank you very much.
So I just want to thank you, Dr. Ostrowski, for a wonderful presentation. I wish we had more time to go even further into your work, but we now have Dr. Umair Shah. And if you take a look at our bench book, you're going to see a lot of places in the law where it says the public health authority, the public health authority, the public health authority may do this, may do that. Well, guess who is the public health authority? But in our area, it's Dr. Umair Shah. And so once again, if I can figure out how to make this all work, I am going to turn this over to Dr. Shah, and I am going to, Dr. Shah, can you hear us?
I can. Thank you,
Okay,
Seth.
wonderful. So I'm going to
can you hear me?
myself, and then you have the floor. And if you could share your screen if you choose to do so.
There we go. Can you see that okay? Sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, so for some reason, I'm seeing my handsome face as opposed to your handsome face. And so I don't know if you've turned your video off. It's not a fatal problem, and you're on. Okay, so it's just it's an artifact of my screen. So just go forwards, and we're happy to hear what you have to say.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, first of all, to our colleagues at University of Houston Law Center, and really just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to be here and to really have Harris County Public Health be a part of this webinar. And as you've been hearing from Mr. Chandler, as well as obviously Dr. Ostrovsky and others, that this is really preparing for public health emergency is one of the biggest challenges that we have throughout the system. And there are a number of challenges. As you know, we like to say public health is the offensive line of a football team, that we have this hashtag invisibility crisis, that people don't really recognize what a health department does or what public health does until something like a coronavirus situation occurs, where now all of a sudden you're in the middle of responding, and now people start to really focus on where is public health and why is it important for public health to be supported. So you see on this first slide just the hashtag invisibility crisis. You've got my Twitter handle here, as well as our department Twitter handle, and a number of other issues that we are dealing with on a daily basis, including our latest report of Harris Cares 2020, which has a number of focus issues, which includes infectious diseases. And so I do want to make sure that if you haven't had a chance to go to our website to download that, please do that. Harris County is big, it's diverse, it's complex in every sense of the word. Really, it's important to just recognize that we're the third most populous county in the United States with over 4.7 million people. We're spread over approximately the size of Rhode Island. We have 34 municipalities, the largest being the fourth largest city in the country, city of Houston. But we have the largest unincorporated area in the country with 2 million people, which I think brings up, as Seth and others have highlighted, brings up a tremendous amount of challenges, because in the midst of coronavirus, we're really thinking about all the legal ramifications. But what would you do in the midst of having to quarantine somebody in the city, maybe different than what would be occurring in the non-city portion of the county? So I think there are some nuances, though. Regardless of which direction or which jurisdiction you're in, we are under the Texas state law, which includes the local health authority aspects on health and human services, health and human services codes that really allow us to, health and safety codes that really allow us to really think about what are the authorities that local health authorities like myself have for a community as large as ours. Harris County Public Health, again, when we do our job, it's largely invisible, whether it's protecting against mosquitoes or restaurant inspections or mass vaccinations, as we did back in H1N1, our activities for dangerous animals, et cetera. When we do our job in public health, it is really largely behind the scenes. And I think that's a big challenge when we have something like a novel coronavirus, because everybody starts to really hone in on the healthcare community, but we have to remember the healthcare community plus public health is really the crux of the matter. I won't go into too much of this. Dr. Ostrovsky mentioned this, just a reminder about coronavirus that we have seen this before. Usually we're looking at mild, like the common cold, but it can get severe diseases such as MERS and SARS in the past. The current COVID-19 now that the number of deaths from COVID-19 have exceeded both MERS and SARS combined from the previous situations that we had with these kinds of coronaviruses. Obviously, COVID-19 is believed to have origins in animals, likely bats, but there's really a lot of similarity, and I know Dr. Hotez is going to be speaking to some of this with previous coronavirus and some of the real similarities between these viruses. Transmission, as we know, is animal to person initially, but now we know that person to person is in play, and certainly more information is needed because this is an evolving situation. And so we're learning something new every single day in terms of how this virus is spread, what kind of contact is necessary, what kind of protections are needed, and really what can we do to assure that we get that information out to the appropriate parties. Majority of people have very mild symptoms, as we know, mostly respiratory in nature, but we do recognize the progression to pneumonia. And just a reminder that there was a blip in the number of cases in China, and that was really due to the fact that there was not just the testing where somebody had to have lab-confirmed tests to say they had novel coronavirus, but they expanded that to also include clinical, including symptoms plus radiographic evidence. And so we saw a blip in that. But respiratory illness, as well as some GI illness, and really the key is that we're seeing a mortality rate, a case fatality rate that's being reported in the 2% range. We've seen it as high as 2.9%, 2.3%, 2%, and just a reminder that seasonal flu is 0.1%. So we're really looking at essentially 20 times the mortality rate of the seasonal flu, which, by the way, is what's in Harris County today, and we need to make sure we continue to protect ourselves from influenza. And then, as Dr. Ostrovsky mentioned, that supportive care is really the where we are with treatment right now, because there is no specific treatment that's available. And I won't go through this, but just to remind people that there is an incubation period of up to 2 weeks, and that all age groups can be impacted, though older adults and those with pre-existing health conditions are the ones that we're mostly concerned about. Again, as you look at what has been happening across the globe, we have now exceeded the 70,000 case mark across the world, with the vast majority of those, and I do want to emphasize the vast majority of those, unfortunately, in mainland China, but we have seen spread in dozens of other countries, and certainly now we've exceeded the 2,000 mark when it comes to deaths. I think it's also important to recognize the number that have recovered, and we haven't really gotten as much attention to this because people are focusing obviously on the number of cases and the number of deaths. But I do also want to make mention that it's not just the numbers or the sort of the deaths, if you will, which obviously are concerning enough, but we really are keeping track of where it's spreading, how it's spreading, and what are the steps that need to be taken in order to interrupt that spreading, which I think is also key. And also the reminder that we did have a blip in the case counts over the last several days to week because of the way the clinical diagnosis was now added into the mix in mainland China. As of, I guess today, we've had 29 confirmed cases of, I'm sorry, yesterday, because I wanted to make sure I had the date correct. As of yesterday, we had 29 confirmed cases in the U.S., and that is a reminder that we had 15 cases in the U.S., but obviously the persons that were on the Americans that were on the cruise ship that tested positive then were added into the case count. We had the first case in Seattle. It was a traveler, this was a traveler to Wuhan who self-reported just north of Seattle. That's how this all started as the first case in the continental United States. And subsequently, we had cases in other states, including Wisconsin, California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Arizona, and obviously we have a case now in Texas, which I will talk about in just a moment. In Chicago, there was the first human-to-human transmission that we had, and that was obviously of concern of a spouse of an individual who was had not traveled to Wuhan, but tested positive in being in close quarters with somebody who had traveled to Wuhan. CDC reports people that are under investigation, PUIs, if you will, but also they have been listing folks who have tested negative, and certainly folks who have also are pending the diagnosis. And so certainly I think it's also important to recognize that there has been limited transmission in the US outside of that one case in Chicago. But what has been really interesting is that the CDC has been saying previously that this has been this is a low risk to the American public. And then about a week ago, the verbiage changed just a little bit, where it was the immediate risk to the American public is considered low. So the use of the word immediate was added into the mix, which I think is something that we need to obviously be mindful of. Here locally, as I mentioned, there is one case in Texas. The nuance or the asterisk of this was that this was a traveler to Wuhan who had actually come back and was quarantined at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio in Bexar County, and then subsequently developed symptoms. This was last Thursday, and that individual then not just developed symptoms, but was diagnosed, was tested for novel coronavirus and tested positive, and then was transferred because of additional symptoms to an area hospital. That individual was not a resident of the state of Texas, but was quarantined there. So on the one hand, you could say quarantine worked. On the other hand, we also have to keep mindful that quarantine and restriction and isolation are mechanisms to delay, hopefully interrupt, but delay transmission in, for example, the United States. But the way CDC has placed this is that, or at least put this out there, is that this is not going to interrupt or stop transmission. By comparison, we have 10,000 flu deaths this season and no deaths from COVID-19 in the US, and certainly no cases in our region, and including no cases in Harris County. But that's important because if you go to certain parts of our community, there have been a lot of rumors and a lot of real illicit information that has been incorrect, where people are sharing information that in our own community where we have 0 cases of COVID-19, that there are cases and there are counts of either people who have been confirmed or who have died from novel coronavirus because they're spreading misinformation and rumors. So I just want to make sure that's clear, that we have 0 cases, but that does not mean that the second part of any outbreak is not in the mix, which is the misinformation, which becomes a second front that we oftentimes have to fight. Travel guidance, I'm just going to say that, as you know, the Department of State has issued guidance not to travel to China unless it's essential travel that's needed. So non-essential travel, please do not. You should avoid. But at the same time, we have to remember that people that are coming back from China because they had to travel for whatever reason or were already there and coming back are now being directed to 11 designated airports, and they're listed here. Only one of those is in Texas, Dallas-Fort Worth, not the airport in Houston. But I think it's important to remember, regardless of how somebody gets into a community, we really want to make sure that we're emphasizing the message about monitoring symptoms for 14 days, whether it's self-monitoring or they're under a public self-monitoring by the individual, or self-monitoring under public health supervision, or some sort of restriction all the way to quarantine. It's been happening at various federal facilities throughout the country.
But Dr. Shah, just to be clear, I know there are very few flights that are actually coming out of China right now into Houston. And maybe the answer is there aren't any. But if there were such flights, There's no governmental screening of those persons, even for fever. They're just advised to self-monitor. Is that correct?
So what's happening actually at these, let me go back, what's happening at these 11 designated screening airports is that they're actually prepared to, depending on what's happening and what they determine in terms of risk, they're prepared to actually do more of a clinical evaluation. So it just really starts with first screening questions, and based on the screening questions, the quarantine station is able to do additional evaluation and even transfer over from that, from that airport to EMS to a hospital or a clinical care facility. So the answer is yes, they're actually able to do more directed screening from a medical standpoint, not just from providing information, say, be on your way.
But just to push on a little bit, given what's happened on that cruise ship and given Americans' reluctance to confess to things that might cause them difficulties, if the person says, oh, I'm feeling fine, they basically falsely respond that they're feeling fine, there's no actual medical screening that's done of them, even at those airports?
So there is medical screening that's done at those airports, so that is available. But each of those screening stations obviously has a combination of administrative and clinical personnel that are then making the decision on what needs to happen with the individual passengers that are coming off. But I do want to, so thank you for mentioning that, because I do want to make one quick comment, which is that I'm not convinced that the screening is going to eventually pick up, at the airport is going to pick up a traveler who is going to be symptomatic, because you have to remember it's the 14-day incubation period. So if somebody is coming off of a flight and still a day or two into where they're, where they are symptomatic, asymptomatic, but they develop the symptoms after they land, let's say 2 days later, that's where you're not going to pick it up at the airport screening. But I do think it's also important to remember that if somebody is coming from Wuhan, they are automatically going to a 14-day quarantine. So that's happening at these federal quarantine stations that are being set up, not at those 11 airports, but at, for example, Lackland Air Force Base, et cetera. So there is it's nuanced on what's happening at an airport versus what's happening for somebody who was traveling to China versus Hubei province versus what's happening for somebody who traveled to Wuhan and back. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And we just talked about this. There's screening obviously happening for individuals. And then in the public health realm, then we're making decisions on high risk, medium risk, low risk, and no identifiable risk, essentially with a robust system of getting, this is where our epidemiologists have been very busy. And I don't mean just ours at Harris County Public Health, but I mean across the country, of trying to determine, based on questioning, based on travel history, based on exposure risk, we're determining who falls into which category in concert with our state and federal partners, high risk, medium risk, low risk, and even potentially no identifiable risk. So I think that's critical, because then that starts to add in, if somebody is asymptomatic initially, but it develops symptoms and they're in a low risk category, what do you do? Versus somebody who is in a high risk category who develops symptoms, what do you do? And I think that's absolutely critical as well for us to then determine what we're gonna do with those individuals. What we've been doing locally is very, this is an image of our team. We've actually been, we tagged up today, it's been greater than 50 days. We've been up, it's our Harris County Public Health Readiness Team, and I've been lock in step with Dr. David Purse at the City of Houston, as well, and the two health departments in our community, as well as our regional health departments, and locked in with the state health department. We've been really ensuring that we are consistent. I always say that we don't have to be the quote unquote the same, but we have to be consistent across what's the guidance, how are we going to handle things, because we want to make sure that people are assured that regardless of where they live, that they are going to be given a fair shake and a consistent way of looking at how we're approaching this, this process. And so just very quickly, internal communication and coordination, but also establishing the triggers and the indicators so that we can say, we can know what to do in case of increased disease activity or spread. And then we're also coordinating across the department, including developing protocols with a stepwise progression, participating in real opportunities to share information, our legal considerations, which obviously this webinar is also very much centering on, but what are those legal considerations that really come into play on a daily basis, because on a daily basis, we are handling situations that we need to assure that we are ahead of, and then certainly supporting the frontline training and the communication. I do want to say this is a key area because it's not just communication internally and to our partners in the community and the media, but it's also to our healthcare providers. And we have been, we Harris County Public Health operate the regional HAN, the Health Alert Network, and we have been pushing out half dozen messages thus far to our healthcare providers so that our hospitals, our infectious disease practitioners, our emergency department physicians have access to the latest guidance, because it has evolved with the CDC as the situation has evolved. And the final message on that is we've also sent out messages to our veterinary public health, our veterinary healthcare providers from a veterinary HAN, HAN Health Alert Network as well, just so they're connected also in what's happening in our community. Community outreach events have been very much a part of what we've been doing during the day, the weekends, and the evenings. I'm so proud of the team and all the different activities they've been doing, along with our elected officials, particularly with Judge Hidalgo, the county judge. Has been very, very focused on this. And we have actually particularly spent a lot of time in the Asian American community. We've had reports that in the Asian American community in Houston, we have seen in Chinatown, the reports are that decrease in traffic to grocery stores and restaurants up to 50–60%, even though we have had 0 cases of coronavirus, a novel coronavirus in our community. And I think it's really important that we continue to remember that stigma and misinformation is key, that we also have to fight the second front of what's happening in the midst of all of this. Let me close with—
Could I follow up on that point?
Yeah, please.
Which is, you've highlighted that even the most remote, almost bordering on absurd fear of coronavirus has led to substantial changes in commercial practices with respect to the shopping at Asian markets and the like. And I've talked earlier about this delicate line we have to have between being too blasé about it, in which case we're vulnerable if it did hit to an exploding situation, but also the consequences of being overly fearful of it, which are quite detrimental to the economy and to people generally. And would you agree that what we have seen happening with respect to our Asian community in the west of Houston, which is an absurd over-response to, at what is the moment, an infinitesimal threat, is exactly why we have to be very careful in treading that line, not to become complacent, but also to make sure that fear is not unnecessarily spread?
Absolutely. I think Seth, you hit it right on the mark. Our county judge actually launched, if you go to our website, there's a link to it, and obviously our information is at the bottom of these slides, but on the readyharris.org, readyharris.org, the Office of Emergency Management site, a rumor control page. So there's information about rumors and how to really think about local rumors, not global. We're not talking about the rumors there's a whole host of rumors that are occurring across the world, but we're talking about local rumors that are really stigmatizing the Asian American community, particularly Chinese Americans. And so here's an example. We've heard stories of children who are going to school, who are of Chinese descent, who have never been to China, ever been to China, not in the last 14 days, not in the last 6 months, not in the last 6 years, ever. And they're being called names, or they're saying, you've got, you've got coronavirus as a joke, bad enough. But then the parents of a classmate not inviting that child to the birthday party because they're concerned that that child is in a family that may have coronavirus. So very quickly, Seth, it now becomes an issue. We've had an instance where a physician was sharing information from a website that is notorious for sharing fake news, and a physician sharing information at a school with other parents that said that there were 4 confirmed novel coronavirus deaths in Houston.
Let me push
That's
back.
These are real. There, I guess where I was going was, before you ask your question, just what I'm saying is that everybody has seen memes and because of names like Corona, they're jokes and things. And it's one thing to get to this point of being able to share this kind of information. But what happens is at some point, and I don't have a clear line of when at that point is, but we move from something that is potentially harmless to something that actually has impact. And I don't have the right line on that, but I know that there has been impact in our community, and that is a concern to me.
All right, let me push back the other way and get your views on this. So in China, we saw, because of the fear of false reports of disease, we saw, in fact, the authorities crack down on what turned out to be true reports of disease. And that has largely led to the explosion of an epidemic in China, in what looks to me to be a parallel to sort of what happened at Chernobyl, where no one wanted to alarm anyone about the escape of radioactivity, and therefore the situation was made much worse. And so, while any rational person should fully understand that it is absurd to not be going to Chinese restaurants in Houston because there could be the world's tiniest chance of coronavirus, nonetheless, can you assure us that if we do see reports of coronavirus here that are medically substantiated, that you will not be stomping down rumors, but your office will be providing accurate information and telling the public and having people take sensible, not exaggerated, but sensible precautions?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are committed to do that. I think the concern is when you do not have the word you used was substantiated. When it's not substantiated and it's really misinformation, rumors, and inaccurate information, then what it does actually is it impacts all of us, because it actually impacts the public health system, healthcare providers. It makes it harder for us to do our job. And then when you have vilification of certain individuals based just on dissent, that what it also does is it makes it less likely that individuals who might have symptoms that may have traveled and or are concerned, that they're going to present to the healthcare community or the public health department. And so there is a real concern, and I agree with you that you have to balance that. Government then has to be transparent and honest, but we also have to balance that with assuring that rumors are stamped out. Because look, if somebody says there are 4 cases of something, then tell us where those 4 cases are, where you're hearing, so we can go investigate. If my EPIs are twiddling thumbs, not that they have been, but I want them to be out there investigating and figuring out where they are. And if we can't do that because all we're getting is we heard from a mom's moms or a dad's dads or a soccer this, that, at a practice of whatever, that, what does that really lead us to? It leads us to information chaos. And I think that's the challenge that we have. Fair enough?
Absolutely. Sorry for the interjection.
Almost, that's okay. Almost done. I wanted to get through these quickly, so I wanted there'd be an opportunity for really some questions, and I see Dr. Hotez teeing up as well. So I got to really be careful because his screen's gonna get big, and then all of a sudden I'm gonna get kicked off the webinar. That was a joke. He didn't hear me, but just so you hear me, it's also important to remember that we have seen this before. And I think the most important piece of this is that when Ebola happened, and there was concern, obviously, with Mr. Duncan at Presbyterian Hospital in Dallas, all of a sudden, we started caring about Africa and what happened in the continent of Africa. And I use the word continent because very quickly people started to think of Africa as a country. They forgot that there were 3 countries in West Africa that were in play, but they thought that East or North Africa were also in play. So Eritrea and Morocco and other nations in Africa, if you were from there, that you must have Ebola. And if you don't believe me, I can give you my own instances where I actually went to a Home Depot and an individual who was from Sierra Leone, and I shook his hand, and because he helped me with trying to figure out where the lumber was, and he said to me, "Thank you for shaking my hand." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You know, since people found out where I was from, you're the first person who's shaken my hand in the last 2 or 3 weeks." So I just want to underscore that this stigmatization is a real issue. And during Zika, we had the additional stigmatization that occurred with our Latin American communities. So it was in Latin America. And so then there was the us versus them about people and coming into potentially exposing mosquitoes or being exposed from mosquitoes to Zika, and Zika coming into our communities. And there was that vilification happen. And we're starting to see a very similar type of trend, unfortunately, here with this. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. So what we're doing is to fight those with fact sheets, English, Spanish, Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, Korean. We have a lot of information on our website. I would ask you to go to it. It includes the link to the webpage I mentioned, the rumor control webpage, but it also includes information that links to WHO and CDC as well as other partners, and really also includes really local information, which I think is also absolutely critical. And we're pushing out information on social media because we cannot stop just because we think that there is not a novel coronavirus in our community. We have to continue to be prepared. And so let me just close by saying that public health just makes common sense. The picture on the right is when I had hair and it was not gray in Hurricane Katrina response in 2005. And at that time, I didn't ask for widgets or new items at 3 o'clock in the morning, but I put an official Form 214 in that asked for common sense. And it has stayed with me that the role of public health just makes common sense. But as this picture in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake in Haiti, it takes a village, and it takes all of us to protect our children, our communities, and really all the different vitality and well-being of those communities. And this is an image of our Harris County Public Health executive team, and very proud to be supported by and to support them and our incredible staff members who have, as I've mentioned, for the last 2 months have been responding to and preparing and assuring that we are ready for what is coming potentially down the road. So with that, let me turn it back to you. Please follow us on Twitter and social media. And we do believe that Harris Cares is an important way to remember that we must care about our communities. Thank you, Seth.
Thank you. Dr. Shah, we've got about 6 minutes for questions. Let me pose some to you if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Some of your audience is likely to be healthcare workers and personnel at schools and universities who may find themselves on the front line when someone comes in with fever, runny nose, whatever. What can you tell them to give them reassurance, or what precautions, if any, should they be taking? How should they be thinking about this new situation?
So, and that's a great question. I think right now we have to just remind ourselves that we do not have novel coronavirus in this country outside of folks who have traveled, and or the one case where we've had human-to-human transmission in Chicago, that there is some exposure. Now, remember, there's a little bit of a nuance because of the travelers coming off the cruise ship, but outside of that, we have not had this what we've seen in other countries of transmission human to human in the U.S. It is not widespread in our communities like influenza is. By the way, all the things that you need to do to protect yourself from the flu will help protect you from a variety of respiratory conditions. That includes obviously washing your hands and covering your cough and even getting the flu shot, but also making sure you isolate yourself if you are sick with respiratory symptoms. Don't go to work, don't go to congregate settings, etc. But the real issue is that if you have traveled in those last 14 days, or if you know you have been exposed to know that you've been exposed to a confirmed case. Think about all the know and the confirmed that I'm saying of a case, not I suspect or I thought, or somebody was somewhere in the grocery store and I thought that person was Dr. Shaw and he was like not looking at me right, that kind of a situation. Then what we really want you to do in that case is to contact your healthcare provider and or contact the public health department. But if you are a coworker or an employer, we want you to keep that in mind, that the steps that have been put in place for restrictions of travelers should pick up individuals who have traveled to China in those 14 days. Now, if there is a scenario where it has not picked that up, then certainly keep us informed so we can do what we need to do from an epi standpoint to investigate.
Okay, let me ask you two hard questions. First, undocumented person. They're often afraid to go to any governmental authority. What happens when an undocumented person comes to one of your people and says, I'm concerned I might have some potential for exposure? Do you put a rope around them and send them to ICE? What do you do?
We do not. We believe the integrity and at the local community level and the trust and transparency that needs to be in place for a community member to protect the broader Harris County community means that if individuals, because of documentation status or because of their citizenship status, I should say more clearly, that they are afraid to present to a local health department, that would drive them underground. And driving somebody underground, not just for this, but for tuberculosis or for an STD or name the other infectious diseases, what that does is it puts the rest of the community at risk. So absolutely not. When somebody presents to us, we do not ask their citizenship status. What we ask is, tell us your symptoms, tell us where you've been, give us the information that we can help understand and determine if there is a health risk to you or to our community, but not to, quote unquote, turn them in to law enforcement.
Okay, next question. This is a hard one. What would it take? What would you want to see before you involuntarily quarantine someone who was not necessarily diseased? You hadn't quite confirmed it, but gosh, it looked like it an awful lot. What would you do? What would it take?
I think first and foremost, we have to remember that we believe that the relationship of the healthcare provider, the physician, the team, the relationship of the epidemiologist or our providers, our healthcare team, our public health team, that relationship and that trust and that conversation, that dialogue is really the most important way to convince somebody to say, look, we're concerned about you, or we're concerned about your potential for transmitting a disease to others in the community around you, and hopefully not get to that point of involuntarily having to quote unquote quarantine. But if we did feel that there was somebody that, let me back up one quick caveat here, Seth, which is, again, we have to remember that this is not about rumors. This is not about even clinical physicians who are, through their goodness of their heart, trying to do the best they can to say, I think this person might have novel coronavirus. Because we've had instances where somebody has, across the country, where a healthcare provider is absolutely convinced that this person has novel coronavirus, and guess what? They have the flu. So I think what we have to recognize is that if we really got to that point where we really felt that it was that highly concerned individual, this is the one, then it's different for how we would treat the first versus how we would treat if it's throughout our community. And I think we would need to really have the steps in place. And if that means that the legal tools have to be in there for involuntary, some sort of isolation, restriction, or quarantine, then we're prepared to do the control measures to do that. But if we felt that there was either another mechanism, or we were uncertain, or now it's throughout the community, and that is not the mechanism that's going to really control this in our community, because right now what we're trying is to prevent it from spreading in our community, then at that point, maybe that would not be the tool that we would employ.
Thank you. One other quick question I'm hoping you can answer in 30 seconds so we can get Dr. Hotez on. I've got a question from an attendee. How long does the COVID testing take?
That's a great question. So the CDC right now is the only place in the U.S. that is doing the laboratory testing. They did send out some test kits that were to states, and they were trying to get that the capacity to expand. And unfortunately, there were some problems with the batches of tested, and they were sent back. And so it's still now at the CDC. We are seeing that it is from the time they receive the sample, we're getting a 24-hour turnaround. So we should, within, obviously, the time you send it to the time you get the result back, a 24, 36 to 48-hour turnaround.
Thank you so much. Dr. Shah, that was a very helpful presentation. I appreciate your willingness to participate. What you guys are doing is incredibly important. And I'm now going to shift gears, and I'm going to actually
thank you.
Mute you. And if I can somehow get control back here, let's see here. One day I will be a master of Zoom. This will stop. Yes, I want to stop. All right. I'm going to go to my screen. We're going to share that. And now we're going to go to, how do I get to Dr. Hotez?
Let me see if I can do that.
Okay. I need to stop my own sharing. Okay, great. There's Dr. Hotez, who should now be front and center. And I believe it's all yours.
Okay, great. Do you think you can hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
All right, so let's begin. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Peter Hotez, and I'm a professor at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital. We develop vaccines for emerging and neglected infections, including we have 2 coronavirus vaccines, actually 3 coronavirus vaccines in various stages of development. So we've been drawn into this discussion in a very interesting way. And what I'll do today is try to provide an overview of some of the important trends that I think we're seeing with regards to coronavirus, particularly as it pertains to global health. And I hope it dovetails nicely on the excellent remarks from Dr. Shah. Dr. Shah is a tough act to follow, so I'll do my best. I think the only thing I'm worried about for this presentation is there may be some components that are redundant, especially the introductory things that others have said. So if that's the case, I hope you'll bear with me. So let's get started. There's my introductory slides, and if you have questions, feel free to send me an email. It's very easy to find on the internet. It's just Hotez, H-O-T-E-Z, at BCM, that stands for Baylor College of Medicine, .edu, Hotez at bcm.edu. So if we go to the first slide, the way I like to start this is to say, in some ways, coronaviruses are not new. In some ways, they are new. If you look at the left-hand slide, we've known that coronaviruses can cause upper respiratory infections, and we've known about this for a long time. So here are the names of 4 different coronaviruses that cause upper respiratory infections. They're actually a cause of the common cold in many respects. Not the most common, as say rhinoviruses are, but they can cause cold symptoms, and rarely they can even, those same virus strains can cause lower respiratory infections, even pneumonias, but rarely. The game changer started in the 21st century when we began to see different types of coronaviruses transmitted from animals to humans. And these caused very serious epidemics, and 2 of them actually caused pandemics, meaning infections being transmitted in multiple countries. So we saw this first with the SARS coronavirus in 2003, then the MERS coronavirus in 2012, and now this new coronavirus, which has multiple different names. And the game changer was, 1, transmitted from animals to people, and then there was human-to-human transmission, and secondly, causing severe complications leading to pneumonia, and the complications of pneumonia, which includes something called ARDS, I'll define that in a minute, and then death. So if we go to the next slide, this is a summary of those 3 pandemic coronaviruses. So we're now actually in our 3rd major one that's causing serious illness and even death. As I mentioned before, it began in 2003 with SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, originated out of Guangdong, also known as Canton in southern China, affected 26 countries, 8,000 cases and 800 deaths, and caused a serious epidemic in the city of Toronto, Ontario, that shut down the city for a while. Then in 2012, we had the Middle East respiratory syndrome, the MERS coronavirus. This one originated on the Arabian Peninsula, that caused also large numbers of death, 858 in 27 countries. And now this latest one, which is going by different names. So the World Health Organization has recommended the term COVID-19. Others are calling it SARS-2 for reasons I'll point out in a little bit, because there's a lot of genetic similarity between SARS-1 in 2003 and SARS-2. And there's some other new names being proposed. And this one, of course, started in central China, in the city of Wuhan, and then spread across Hubei province. And it's hard to keep up with the numbers. The numbers go up every day. When I made this slide a couple of days ago, 66,000 cases, 1,600 deaths. Now we're getting close to 2,000 cases and 80,000 deaths, and it's affecting 25 nations. Let's look at some of the features of this SARS-2 coronavirus, or COVID-19. One of the exciting things about this virus is the information that we're getting so quickly. So if you remember, after SARS in 2003, it took us about a year or 9 months to isolate the virus, get the genetic code of the virus, find what receptor it's binding to in the lungs. And this information has been accelerated greatly almost 20 years later. So in 2020, just a few weeks after the start of the epidemic, we've learned so much about this virus. And it just might interest people to know that where are we getting this information? A lot of it is because Chinese scientists are not necessarily waiting for the peer review process. They're graciously putting their information up on a preprint server that's offered by Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, which has an important history in terms of the history of molecular biology in this country. It's called bioRxiv. There's also now a medRxiv. And what we've learned from this is as follows. First of all, this new SARS-2 coronavirus is similar to the SARS-1, 80 to 90% similar, and about 70 to 80% similar in the spike protein. So those little knobs that you see on the surface on the upper right hand from the virus are as the portion of the virus that docks with the receptor in the lungs and elsewhere. In contrast, it's only about 50% similar to the MERS coronavirus, so that means it's so SARS-2 much more resembles SARS-1 than MERS, and both of them bind to the same receptor in the lungs, which has been identified as an acetylcholinesterase type 2, ACE2. This is found in the lungs. It's also found in endothelial cells. We're still in the deep learning curve about this virus. It looks as though this virus is significantly less lethal than SARS-1, which had 10% mortality. So far, our best estimate is around 2% mortality, which is still quite significant. Remember, for instance, most seasonal flu strains are about 0.1 to 0.2% lethal. So we're talking about something that's still about at least 10 times more lethal than influenza, even though it's less than the SARS-1. And some have pointed out that it's as lethal as the 1918 flu pandemic strain. So the 1918 flu pandemic killed about 2% of the people it infected. This is around that, so it's still a significant pathogen. One of the things we're finding is those who are requiring hospitalization and death, there's some high-risk groups. So one of them are those over the age of 60. When I made this slide, the early numbers were looking, males were at greater risk than females. That's not really panning out as much. So we can kind of take the male piece with a grain of salt. Also, those with underlying diabetes and hypertension seem to be at greater risk of hospitalization and death. And we don't really understand why. And this is actually getting to be a very interesting trend now. We're seeing this with multiple pathogens now, that there's this interplay between diabetes and the pathogen. So for instance, those who are dying from dengue in India are those with underlying diabetes. Those on the Texas-Mexico border with severe, this is work done by a group at University of Texas Brownsville, has shown that those who are getting very sick from tuberculosis are those with underlying diabetes. And we really don't understand why. And that's important because diabetes rates are going up globally, and this is going to emerge as an important new cofactor. The other population at risk, of course, are healthcare workers, frontline healthcare workers, and tragically, we're hearing stories coming out of Wuhan of prominent physicians, as well as other healthcare workers who are dying in this epidemic because they're on the front line and don't have the protection that they need. So we're really hearing about some heartbreaking stories because of this. On the next slide, I mentioned that these new coronaviruses of pandemic threats are often of animal origins. So we know, for instance, with SARS-1, it was originally circulating in bats, and there's some thought that it then jumped to this curious-looking animal called the palm civet in those wet markets in Guangdong province. Wet markets mean, if you've ever been to them, they're pretty tough places to see. They're basically exotic animals kind of caged together under not very nice conditions. Oftentimes those animals are dead and dying in the same cage. We saw this again in Saudi Arabia with the MERS coronavirus, where it jumped from bats to camels. And there's some question about whether these were a true jump, or what, in other words, it went from bats in the case of SARS-1, the palm civets to people, or in the case of mares, whether it went to bats, to camels, to people, or whether it's a matter of camels and people and palm civets and people got infected at the same time. There's some emerging evidence that this curious animal that's found in Asia and Africa, the pangolin, also played a pivotal role in the new SARS-2 virus, or what we're also calling the N coronavirus, whether it went from bats to this pangolin to people. The picture on the lower left is Joe Petrosino, who's a colleague of mine, who's the chair of molecular virology and microbiology at Baylor. Whether, he's been doing some meta-analysis of the genomes of these viruses and thinks he has some evidence that the pangolin plays a central role, although it's still a possibility that it's a matter of the virus simultaneously infected these pangolins and humans. Unfortunately, what happened was once Chinese authorities had implicated a specific wet market in Wuhan as the potential source of the virus, that market was taken down and destroyed before virologists had the chance to sample all of the viruses from the different animals. So it's still a bit of a controversy what the nature of this, what we call a zoonotic virus, was. And we're on a steep learning curve at figuring out the clinical transmission of this virus and how to recognize it. This is some new information that just came out last week from a paper in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, looking at 138 hospitalized patients. So what they found was the median age was 56 years and 54% of men. That's why I backpedaled a bit on saying the male to female predominance. Now again, this is a selected group of those that we know have severe enough illness to require hospitalization. One of the things that was found that was very ominous in this study in 138 hospitalized patients was how easy it was for the virus to be transmitted from person to person. So there was a lot of hospital-associated transmission. And that's going to be a real warning if this virus gains a foothold in the United States, is that we're really going to have to put our healthcare workers under alert and give them adequate protective measures. And we saw this with Ebola in 2014, where we had the infection transmitted to 2 ICU nurses. We have to get ready for that possibility happening here in the United States. These individuals are presenting with fever, fatigue, dyspnea, is difficulty breathing, dry cough, and a drop in lymphocyte counts. What was interesting in this JAMA series, about 10% did not present with any respiratory symptoms. They presented with gastrointestinal symptoms of nausea and diarrhea 1 to 2 days before the pulmonary symptoms started. And the reason that's significant is because in this hospital in Wuhan, 10% were some of them were admitted actually to the surgical suite, thinking they had a surgical condition of the abdomen, not realizing that in fact they had this new SARS-2 coronavirus. So that's going to make things very challenging as well. The typical.
Could I interject with a question here? Which is the symptoms you're describing: fever, fatigue, dry cough, nausea, diarrhea. I think that's what's known in the medical world as non-specific. That is, that could be almost anything. And
yeah, that's right. And although in the case of the GI symptoms, it was severe enough to warrant hospitalizations to the surgical suite. So I mean, I think I know where your question is heading. Is this just sort of non-specific flu-like symptoms? And I think I'm gonna come back to that, because we're gonna have to have our antenna up, because remember, we're still right now in the US in the middle of flu season. It's a bad flu season this year. And the projections are this flu season in the US is gonna go to May. So in fact, I have an op-ed that came out on Fox News just this morning, looking at the possibility of a triple epidemic of flu, this coronavirus, as well as measles, because the peak measles season is late winter, early spring. So we could be in for some rough sledding over the next few weeks.
And if I could follow up, I know in the US, in many areas, it'll be possible to get a CAT scan or maybe get a test through the CDC to confirm whether it's coronavirus or one of these other many things. But I'm thinking of the many less developed medical systems that exist throughout the world, or even possibly in pockets of the US. How are they going to deal with differentiating false beliefs that someone has coronavirus from the real situation?
Well, remember why Dr. Tedros called this public health emergency of international concern a few weeks back. The WHO did this in some ways not because they were worried about the U.S. and Western Europe, but the feeling is we have the health system in place to adequately diagnose and isolate patients. The big worry is what happens if this virus moves into Asian countries with weaker health systems, such as Myanmar or Laos or Cambodia or Philippines. That's a big worry. And remember also, we have 2 to 3 million Chinese working in Africa right now through President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative. And what happens if this emerges into a sub-Saharan African country? Will we even know about it? So that's a big concern. Anyway, the ICU complications include what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome. And those are the ones who are often dying in shock because these individuals, in response to the overwhelming virus infection, produce lots of host cytokines that trigger leaky blood vessels, capillaries, and this is what can cause shock. And that's oftentimes the mode of demise in these individuals who are older, requiring ICU admissions and ventilation. So let's say a word about how this virus is transmitted. Initially it was going from animals to people, and the initial information coming out of Wuhan was, well, yeah, we're seeing some human-to-human transmission, but not so much. Well, that's all history now, because we know this is actually quite a transmissible virus. And the number we assign for that is what the Brits call R0, what we call R sub 0, reproductive number. It refers to the number of individuals who become infected if a single individual has it. And let me give you an example. So typical seasonal flu is about 1.28. That means 1 to 2 individuals will get infected if a single individual has it. Turns out Ebola is not very transmissible. It's 1 to 2 as well. But this is much more contagious. It's between 2 and 4, 2.24 to 3.58 according to bioRxiv. That's a pretty transmissible agent. And exactly why it's transmissible, we're still trying to understand. Again, it's not as transmissible as measles, which is off the charts. That's 12 to 18, but still pretty significant. So one of the things that's likely is this virus is transmitted through close contact by what we sometimes call droplet contact. That is, if a person sneezes or coughs, those droplets are then travel a short distance in the atmosphere. They land on surfaces so people can touch those micro droplets and infect themselves when they auto-inoculate themselves through their mouth or their eyes. Or a person can directly cough or sneeze on someone's face, and that's how the droplets are transmitted. One of the big questions is whether this virus is also transmitted by the airborne route. That is, the virus is lingering in dust particles on the atmosphere for long periods of time. It turns out, and not many people appreciate the difference, most respiratory viruses are not transmitted via airborne contact. The few exceptions include measles and chickenpox, which is highly transmissible. Most do it through close contact, but we've seen instances where large numbers of people are becoming infected in a single site. So this has raised the question that maybe airborne transmission is also occurring, and maybe that accounts for this virus being so highly transmissible. So for instance, the ship, the boat, the cruise liner that's docked out in front of Yokohama where so many people are getting infected, there are some concerns that this is happening because of airborne transmission. It's not been proven by any means yet, but it's something that I think we're going to have to consider that possibility. There's also the concern based on the fact that patients presenting with gastrointestinal symptoms, whether this virus could be transmitted via the fecal-oral route. That has not been proven, I think, conclusively by any means, but it is a possibility. So this is the patients that presented with gastrointestinal and surgical presentations. I just put it out there because it's going to make things more challenging if patients are presenting with GI symptoms. We would not ordinarily think of wanting to test them for coronavirus, but if we start seeing significant levels of transmission occurring in the US, it's something we're going to have to consider. And I'll leave this with you sort of as background information. Next slide, case fatality rate. So we're hearing a lot of different numbers. And I like this picture from an article that I interviewed in because it kind of explains it all. The case fatality rate really depends on the population you're considering at risk. That is the denominator. So we're hearing a 2% number. But remember, that's partly based on the fact that it's only individuals who are coming to medical attention are the ones who are there's an effort to be diagnosed. The true denominator may be much bigger because we're not considering all of those with low-grade symptoms who may have just some cough and cold symptoms who are just staying at home and not seeing a doctor. So the 2% number is probably on the high side among individuals who, let's say, are coming to the primary care doctor or hospitalized. But in that bottom one there may be many more who are not seeking medical attention. So the true case fatality rate is likely going to go down as we learn more about this virus. In some ways, though, it matters and it doesn't matter because, if you are somebody who's older or have underlying diabetes and hypertension, you're at risk and you have to consider yourself as such. And same with the frontline healthcare workers. So case fatality rates can send some mixed messages sometimes. So what's going to happen? Right now, central China is in a tight spot right now. We're hearing some tough stories about people who are quarantined under difficult circumstances. In some ways, the Chinese leaders are creating a cordon sanitaire all around Wuhan and Hubei province in central China in the hopes that it could be limited there. There is some indication that elsewhere in China, the number of new cases is going down, and we'll see how that plays out. But I think one of the major points of this is the epidemic is having not only big health consequences, but catastrophic economic and security consequences for China, right? The economy is a bit in free fall in China right now. All trade with Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan is stopped. Flights aren't going in. We're seeing big drops in Asian stock markets. And we have to recognize that this is going to be the new normal with serious pandemic threats. And why I think, what I've been talking to members of Congress and elsewhere about, that the G20 countries, the leaders of the G20 still don't quite get it, that they're too much in the old model of what a health threat is, not recognizing the economic and security consequences of this and questioning leadership and et cetera. In the US and Europe, I'll come back to this. We're clearly going to see an increase in the number of cases, but the hope is with the advance notice that we have from information coming out of China that we'll be able to get our arms around this, although there's some concerns there as well, as I'll tell you about in a minute. I especially worry, though, about the unprotected countries, those in Asia with weak health systems, Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. I worry especially about East Africa because we got lots of flights going in and historically into Ethiopia and Kenya through President Xi's Belt and Road Initiative, and that's a major reason for the public health emergency of international concern. Again, let's not underestimate the non-health consequences of this epidemic, economic and political collapse. And, you know, in 2016, I wrote a book called Blue Marble Health, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, that called attention to this, that in fact, when you look at pandemic threats and neglected and emerging infections, overwhelmingly they're diseases of the G20 countries. And in my opinion, on a policy level, global policy level, the G20 nations have not embraced this idea, not gotten their arms around it. So they continually learn the hard way that they've not made the upfront investments that are needed to develop next generation countermeasures for this. We're better than we were because of after SARS in 2002, 2003, we had a new set of international health regulations put in place in 2005 and a global health security agenda. But with each new epidemic, we're learning again.
Dr. Hotez, could I interject with a question here?
Yeah.
And I guess I'll put you a little bit on the spot, but you know, we spoke earlier with Dr. Shah about the very real dangers of being overly fearful regarding a virus and people not going to Chinatown and Houston to restaurants there because they're afraid of COVID virus. But do you think that there are mistakes we are making either nationally or locally right now today, that is not taking into account, in some sense, an existential threat posed by a virus which is difficult to detect, highly communicable, and maybe not as bad as some, but worse than the flu? Are there mistakes that you feel we're making right now?
Yeah, yes, certainly, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think one of the things that we haven't, and I just spoke to the House Science Committee about this. I think one of them is the fact that we're so reactive in terms of countermeasures. So, for instance, we were funded by the NIH to develop SARS and MERS vaccines. And we did that, but then we could not attract funding to move it into clinical trials. Had we done that, potentially we could have repurposed those vaccines now for this epidemic. So we're still in reactive mode, not anticipatory enough. Now, better than we were, right? Because we put in IHR 2005, we've created BARDA, CEPI, and other organizations. So it'd be unfair to say we've done nothing, we've learned nothing. We have, but it's still not enough. And I'm going to come back to that, particularly as it pertains to the US situation in a couple of slides. Let me just first show this, which is what we are doing. We're still using centuries-old methods to tackle epidemics. So the quarantine started in the 14th century when ships coming into Croatia from Asia Minor bringing in plague were prevented from boarding ashore in Croatia because they were worried about bringing plague, and they kept those ships out there for 40 days. And it's amazing to see how in Japan, off Yokohama, they were still using that approach, trapping people on the Diamond Princess, deliberately exposing them to the virus. So it's really quite amazing how little we've learned in 700 years in response to this epidemic. And then not having adequate diagnostics available. So unfortunately, as we were proceeding in this epidemic in Wuhan in China, we learned that the diagnostic tests that we have were not adequately sensitive, so that patients were only getting diagnosed late in their illness as their amount of virus particles increased. So now we had to resort to using CAT scans to make a diagnosis, which is by no means rapid point of care, right? To put a patient into the CAT scanner. And then what's the only therapy that we have right now? Well, the Chinese are now looking at harvesting plasma from patients who have survived their coronavirus infection, hoping to administer exogenously those antibodies to patients. Well, hell, that's what we did in the 1918 flu pandemic. So we've learned that we're still way behind in terms of applying modern technology to epidemic diseases and figuring out how to avoid playing catch up. So we can maybe talk about that more during the question and answers. The other thing I'm worried about now for the United States is what's going to happen over the next few weeks. And the reason I'm concerned is the following, and this is what my op-ed piece was in Fox News this morning on the Fox News website. It's entitled Springtime in America. What inspired me to write it was the CDC director, Bob Redfield, Dr. Redfield, who I've known for a long time, said in a CNN interview that it's likely that this coronavirus, which some are calling SARS-2, others COVID-19, will gain a foothold in the United States, and we'll start seeing significant levels of human-to-human transmission. My worry is, if as that unfolds over the next few weeks, there's other stuff going on. One of them is the fact that our influenza epidemic is still raging. 14,000 people have died in this influenza epidemic, including 92 children, the vast majority not vaccinated despite recommendations. So that there's a lot, some bad flu seasons, they go until May, and this is looking like it's going to be one of them, according to the Centers for Disease Control. So that's problem number one is SARS-2 getting a foothold. Problem number two is influenza occurring. And then there's measles. Remember, the measles came back to America in 2019 because of the anti-vaccine movement. There's every likelihood it's going to come back again in 2020. And historically, when measles peaks, it's late winter, early spring. So the anti-vaccine lobby is lobbying in Hartford, Connecticut today, the state capital. If measles comes back, it's going to happen the exact same time, late winter, early spring, that we'll see SARS-2, that we'll see, here's Douglas, your phone. Start seeing SARS-2, influenza, and measles together. So I'm worried about a triple epidemic affecting the United States. That's the not a doomsday scenario, but it's going to present real problems because, when measles, we learned from the New York City measles epidemic, that when it occurred, it was all hands on deck, right? It's because you have to trace the contacts and contacts of the contacts. So Dr. Shah will tell you, when we had the 4 cases of flu in Harris County last year, that could take up all of the time of the health department. And if he's got to battle that, the same time he's battling flu and SARS-2, we're going to lose. And because not only because it's going to be very challenging to handle, but the economic consequences. And as I said on Fox News this morning, I think, and the day before, I think it could even affect the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. So they're very high stakes because of that, something we're going to have to take seriously.
And Dr. Hotez, let me just make your nightmares worse and ask you to consider the following, which is, do you have a concern that our policies regarding COVID-19 and the spread of the virus might get tangled up in our immigration policies and general controversy about immigration? So for example, what happens when the virus goes into Mexico or Central America? What happens if the virus goes into Nigeria or other sub-Saharan African countries that don't have a great healthcare system?
Well, the problem is this. I was asked by multiple individuals what I thought about the travel restrictions that the U.S. enacted in response to the coronavirus in China and halting travel. I said, travel restrictions are a mixed bag. On the surface, they sound like the right thing to do, but it has consequences because certainly economic consequences for China. But what happens now if and when this virus goes into Philippines or Laos or Cambodia or Nigeria, as you mentioned, or Tanzania, what's the incentive of the government to be transparent about that, right? Because, they're going to look at this and say, well, we can't afford travel restrictions. Our economy is struggling as it is. We can't totally devastate the economic future of our country through travel restrictions. So it's a disincentive to be transparent. It's an incentive not to be transparent. And that's the two-edged sword that I'm worried about. So as we speak, this thing could be moving into some of those Asian countries or into Africa. One, they may not be aware of it, and second, even if they are aware of it, we might not hear about it. So that's of course a big potential risk. Let me just finish up to say, well, what's going to end this? These coronaviruses some of them do show seasonality, meaning that some of the upper respiratory ones peak in winter, die down as we move into the warmer months for reasons that we don't entirely understand. Will this, may have to do with humidity and the ability of virus to travel in the air, crowded conditions in the winter? We really don't know for certain. So will this happen with this coronavirus? It may, but it may not. And also that doesn't tell you what happens in the tropics or the southern hemisphere, where historically viruses with strong winter seasonality can often behave different or even the opposite. All the more reasons that we develop a vaccine. We have two vaccines that we've developed, one for SARS-1, the other one for MERS coronavirus. It looks great in the laboratory. We're looking to see whether we can repurpose the SARS-1, which has about 80% similarity to this one. Here are some slides there. I don't know how much longer you want me to go, but just say that this is a partnership. We've had a coronavirus vaccine program since 2011. It's been a very productive partnership together with our group at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital, together with the New York Blood Center, UTMB Galveston, the Galveston National Laboratory, and Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And we're looking, and we can go more into the science if you want to hear it, why we think it might offer some heterologous protection, but we're also now developing with some NIH bridge funding a vaccine that's specifically designed for the new SARS-2 one. So what we've been advocating for is to do two things at once. One, develop the new receptor binding domain vaccine for the SARS-2 vaccine. But in the meantime, if there's a chance the SARS-1 could be cross-protective, even if it's partially protective, get it into the clinic now. This has become a really full-time effort now of our staff, and my co-director of our vaccine center, Dr. Mary Elena Patazzi, on the phone with the NIH and BARDA and the White House and CEPI and then people in China to see how we can rapidly accelerate this. There's not a lot of precedent for accelerating new vaccines while the epidemic is underway. We have an N of 1 or 2. We did a little bit with new cholera vaccines in Yemen over their terrible epidemic, and then this very impressive story of what happened with the Ebola vaccine from Merck and Company going into Congo, vaccinating 200,000 people in the middle of the epidemic, which may have prevented a catastrophe worse than the West African epidemic in 2014 and would have destabilized the African continent. But it's sort of uncharted space. We don't have a lot of roadmaps for how you accelerate a vaccine during the middle of an epidemic. It's a fascinating series of discussions we've been having. Also, simultaneously, we've been talking to countries in the Middle East, including Israel and Saudi Arabia, practicing what I call vaccine diplomacy, about how, if we could get the green light from State Department, how you would do tech transfer for a vaccine to in Israel or Saudi Arabia or China. We could do a whole hour-long discussion on that as well. So I'll stop there. There's our contact information, and happy if you think we have time to answer some additional questions.
Well, I know our audience, if they could only applaud and you could hear them, you would be deafened for an extremely helpful, little scary presentation. Let me ask you a question, which is, supposing you had the opportunity to address not just Congress on issues of the future, and you could go, and you can't talk about future vaccines. What can public health authorities, what can employers, business leaders do today to properly straddle this problem between not being too fearful, but being cautious enough that we don't find ourselves overwhelmed as China has been and have both a lot of deaths and an economy in turmoil? Well,
I think, there's the short term over the next few weeks, and there's the long term. Over the next few weeks, if our U.S. health authorities, remember, you heard from Umair Shah. Umair Shah is the king of this, right? We often forget how lucky we are being in Harris County in Houston. We have not one but 2 health departments, and they're both amazing. And I sincerely mean that. Harris County Health Department and Houston City Health Department are 2 of the finest in the world. The problem is, turns out the whole country is not like Harris County and Houston. We have tremendous heterogeneity in our ability to respond to infectious disease threats. And we saw this with Zika. As great as Harris County is in Houston, there are some counties in Texas that are barely hanging on, that they're not adequately resourced, both financially, in terms of human capital. And that's true across the country. Everyone says, well, the CDC will solve our problems. It doesn't work that way. The CDC is brought in to advise at the invitation of local and state health departments. The battle is fought at the county and city level across the country, and just tremendous heterogeneity. So that means we have to give our public health people, our heroes in the county and city health departments, every chance to be successful. And what do we need to do from that? If they have to battle flu at the same time they're doing this stuff, we're going to lose. So right off the bat, we need to step up our advocacy for flu vaccination. We're only halfway through the flu epidemic, and 100 kids dying, 14, despite who weren't vaccinated. We've got to counter all of the fake anti-vaccine messaging that's out there around flu that says it doesn't work or this and that. It's garbage. It will save your life, prevent you from being hospitalized and dying. Same with measles, right? The anti-vaxxers claim measles is a benign illness. We have a very aggressive anti-vaccine lobby in the state of Texas that is unfortunately sanctioned by many of our elected leaders in Texas. It's very dangerous. We're at extreme risk for bringing measles back. Again, we have 64,000 kids not getting their vaccines in the state of Texas. Those are the ones we know about. We don't know anything about the 300,000 homeschool kids. So what the business community can do is get behind vaccinating our kids, vaccinating our adults against flu and measles. So good people like Dr. Shaw and the leadership at the Houston City Health Department, Mr. Williams, David Pearce, great people like that are not battling 3 epidemics at once. That's in the short term. In the long term, we have to recognize that these are, forget about public health for a minute. These are economic threats. These can devastate our economy. These will jeopardize security. It'll question our leadership. We need to step up our game in terms of supporting countermeasures. We're doing a little bit with BARDA, a little bit with the NIH. We need to greatly expand that. Look at China right now. It's in free fall. We don't want to see that happen in the United States. And if China had prepared in terms of next generation diagnostics and vaccines, we'd be having a much different discussion right now. And we need to do that in the United States as well.
Thank you. One simple question from a attendee, and it may be one to which you don't know the answer, but If someone tests negative the first time, will they be retested if a false negative is suspected?
You know, I don't know what the algorithm is like. I mean, certainly in China, we learned because of the low sensitivity of the test, 30 to 40%, we found that multiple rounds of testing were necessary. And unfortunately, we even had individuals who are tested negative, put out a quarantine, tested again, they were positive. That created a situation as well. Hopefully the test that we have in the United States is more sensitive, but I haven't seen sensitivity and specificity numbers yet. And I don't know how you would get those because we only have 15 cases so far. So we may not know till we know for a while, but there's probably people, probably some of them who are listening who are more on top of where we're at with diagnostics than I am at this point.
Right. And certainly if anyone wants to chime in on the chat page and provide a better answer, that would be wonderful. Dr. Hotez, I can't thank you enough for taking your valuable time. You're a great leader in this area and I wish you well. I'm now going to, however, turn you off and switch us over to Dr. Vanessa Tilney, who is I still haven't quite gotten the hang of this, but there she is. Okay. Dr. Tilney, can you say something?
Yes, do you hear me okay?
We can hear you just great. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Tilney, who's going to give us a frontline perspective of one university, our very own University of Houston, on dealing with the issues posed by the virus.
Okay, great, thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to join in on this webinar as a participant, Professor Chandler, and it's been actually, I've learned quite a bit this morning, further details, I would say, from Dr. Hotez and Dr. Shah. So pleasure to be here. I am going to share my screen so I can start my slides and just sort of review from our perspective here on campus what we've done and what we will continue to do to handle the situation. So, and so there it is. And
okay, so you are successful.
okay.
And I think if you just press that little presenter icon on sort of the bottom, it will be even better. But if that's difficult, you can just go the way you are.
Okay, I'm gonna actually start the slideshow from the beginning.
That sounds great.
Okay, all right. So I am an internal medicine physician. I am the chief physician and executive director of the University of Houston Student Health Center. The Student Health Center is considered the health authority on campus, or has been per our UH pandemic plan, which is the UH influenza plan. And this is one that's a live document that we revisit on an annual basis and edit as necessary alongside the emergency operations management team and committee. So I just wanted to give my own timeline on how things unfolded. Of course, everyone spoke to the real details, and I'm not going to dwell on that. But essentially, you know, I, as a physician, I'm getting all sorts of alerts via email. And so the New England Journal of Medicine, I get first watch, and I saw just a snippet on my phone early morning. What is this new virus that's appearing suddenly out of a market in Wuhan? And that was kind of in early to mid-January. So I immediately informed my staff during a huddle, hey, there's heads up, there's something on the radar. And then certainly like within days, we're hearing about, you know, this is now potentially human to human spread. And there were travelers, for example, that showed up in Japan, one person, and another in Thailand that were traveling from Wuhan. So, so I immediately started to think about our sort of international student body and thinking about, you know, that we're at a big campus, large enrollment from 42,000 plus in the spring, 46,000 in the fall. And I wanted to contact those that are in departments like the international students and scholars services, as well as learning abroad and language and cultural center, just to see what they have received in terms of news and information from their students arriving, et cetera. But essentially, I informed our staff. We disseminated information as needed to best prepare for those that might be potentially arriving with concerns and inquiries. And we have an internal policy within our health center. We're AAA-HC accredited, and we have a ton of policies, and we have one that's in reference to isolating and immediate transfer of patients with communicable diseases. And so we have like a protocol, of course, but I was also paying attention to what the CDC and WHO recommendations were, and implementing the necessary questions up front for people presenting about, you know, have you traveled within 14 days? Have you had fever, cough, et cetera? And so we do have a particular room set aside with personal protective equipment available for the nurses to usher someone to that room. It is not a negative pressure room, but I'll speak to that in a bit. I immediately informed my AVP of Health and Wellbeing, and you know, contacted the Director of Emergency Operations, vice versa, Kelly Boyson, and very soon after, we coordinated a meeting for what we have a committee emerging health issues advisory board. So you have designees or a representation from a variety of departments on campus, from student housing, again, to the ones that I mentioned before, and academic affairs to convey a purposeful and uniform message. So planning with the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Walker, and media relations was very important, and just trying to be on the same page and make sure that we communicate clearly. We sent out an email you know, from me to the entire student, staff, faculty community, so that they're aware that we are aware, and we are following closely and giving them the links and putting that on our website of the Student Health Center for professors to reference and or communicate with us through our public health update email. And I would respond, and I didn't get flooded with inquiries, but I certainly addressed a handful of just questions. And some of those preceded the presidential ban on travel on the 30th of January. So that's when maybe some students had arrived prior to that change in approach from the US, and you know, soon after funneling travel to 11 airports, and now Lackland Air Force Base, et cetera. So we know what's happening now, and what Department of State is enforcing, et cetera, to help control and follow cases. So for now, just listening and supporting the community and their fears is very important, and directing them to the most reliable resources, which I find to be the DSHS, as well as the CDC. And things to consider would be, you know, like we know that stress levels go up. And are you still hearing me? Yes.
Yes. I wonder if I could interject, and
yes.
We are not seeing you scroll through your slides.
Oh.
And so I'm wondering if you have something that says enable editing on what I'm seeing. And so possibly if that were clicked, it would work. If not, it's not the end of the world.
Okay. Well, I apologize. I hope I didn't lose you.
The audio was coming through fine, but all we see on our screen is your title slide. And so,
okay. Are you seeing this?
Now you're clicking through. That's fine. Just whatever slide you're on.
So I'm so sorry to have lost you all. I don't want to repeat myself.
No, don't repeat. Just keep on going. But
okay.
Maybe she'll get to it, or maybe it's something that I'm doing wrong. But I think we've concluded that.
Okay. Yes. So just jumping ahead, and just the initial steps that we did internally within the health center, knowing that we had to jump on top of this and be well informed and deliver the correct information to the community. And then again, we have a super team at UH. You know, the president has drawn a lot of talent, beginning with Dr. Walker, media relations, the emergency operations. So we communicate well and we planned accordingly, and we will continue to do so. And I think, again, the considerations I just mentioned were just trying to ameliorate the stress as it stands. You know, many students suffer from anxiety and stress from their, you know, their experience during their academic years because of all the pressures. And so this may compound it. And so we want to try and reduce unnecessary concerns by keep sticking with the facts. And, you know, it's all about prevention, and that seems to have been a lot of the discussion on how to reduce spread, since it is considerably contagious. So we're addressing that with digital signage that will be brought onto all the screens across campus, just that I think will help also reduce, hopefully, the spread of flu, which is always a concern each season. And that is basically here. I'm going to share it, sorry. Very simple, just, you know, the typical cover your cough and or sneeze, wash your hands after, toss the tissue into the trash, wash your hands. And then in the letters and such, you know, stay home when not well, seek medical attention if you feel like you need that. That is important to stick with that script. I have been in a variety of conferences. I went downtown for the National Ebola training, which I think was transferable to the current topic of coronavirus and how do we best manage upfront from hospitals to clinical settings, as well as protecting ourselves as healthcare providers with our gowns and shields and face masks when we feel like we might be encountering someone who is identified as a person or patient under investigation. So getting back to the clinic here, you know, we're identifying, isolating, informing. We haven't had any cases present. We've had maybe 3 different individuals over the weeks that had traveled from China or the surrounding Southeast Asia with concerns, and we just were able to reassure them, and we contacted the local health department and we're told that this is not a person that would be considered a PUI. So just stuck with, you know, stay at home if you're coughing, cover your cough, wear a mask, and just follow through on those measures. So in terms of just the ongoing communication, we use VOCHI and UH Alert. We're following the Johns Hopkins dashboard. I've been tuning in to the conference calls weekly with Dr. Hellerstedt, usually leading that. I've attended also the meeting at TMC where Dr. Hotez and Dr. Peirce and a variety of public health and TMC officials were at, and that was helpful. And so we recommend the flu vaccine. We test for flu if they are presenting, because again, the overlap in symptoms. And I'm just continuing that communication with my staff and training them on appropriate hygiene practices, symptom recognition, and conveying that clearly to the patient as well. That is pretty much it, because I think a lot of valuable information preceded what I'm delivering here. But the main thing is we have this UH pandemic plan that we're following, and we're at a level 3 now with increased readiness just through recognizing.
What level do you go up to?
Sorry, to a 1 is max.
Okay.
Normal is 4, and so 3 is increased readiness. And so I think just paying attention to this, rapidly evolving situation, staying well informed, and keeping the conversation going is going to be key. And I'll soon probably call another committee meeting for the emerging health issues to see where we're at in terms of the variety of departments on campus. So.
Well, Dr. Tilney, let me thank you. Let me ask you one final question, which is, I suspect there are a number of attendees. In fact, I know there are a number of attendees from school districts throughout Texas who may not have quite the resources or equipment or sophistication, excuse me, of an entity as large as the University of Houston or the University of Texas or someplace like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you could give them one recommendation that you think would be helpful to them in addressing the potential, which doesn't exist yet, but the potential for COVID-19 to break out here, what would that be?
Well, okay, that is okay. So that is currently a concern because in the early stages, we're able to ask about travel. Did you come from Wuhan? Did you come from Hubei? Did you come from China? And as it continues to spread, at least there's a lag here in the U.S. and we're following those closely. So we do have that advantage. And so we need to follow that pattern because I'm not sure it'll be as relevant in weeks or months to come if we keep just sticking to the script of have you come from China. So just asking if a child, I guess we're talking about like a setting at school, if they're having cough and fever, under any regular circumstances, whether it's coronavirus, that we're worried about, I think, again, we're very concerned about the flu and with the type B and having pediatric deaths this season. I think we need to keep those individuals at home and not, basically spreading that to their classmates. So I think the administration at the schools and the school nurse would have to be astute in recognizing perhaps, whether they're presenting to the office or just going by and coughing, maybe having a chat with, if you're not feeling well, you really can miss class for a couple days and get your homework there. So putting on a mask if the child comes to the nurse's office and then just having that conversation about their symptomatology and contacting the parent and recommending that they stay home until they recuperate would be important. So
and would you agree with Dr. Hotez, who made what I thought personally was a very good point, that in some ways the best thing you can do to help fight COVID-19 is to get yourself vaccinated for flu, get yourself vaccinated for measles, so that we can rule that out, so we don't have to be worrying about that. And you can focus on a real problem rather than one that's pretty darn preventable.
Absolutely. So that was definitely in our first newsletters, like get your flu shot, because that's a great point to make. We want to reduce that. That way you can kind of confine or reduce the differential, hopefully. Although we know the flu vaccine may not have perfect coverage, if someone has had their flu shot and their MMR, we're going to think a little bit less of that being the culprit or the cause for their cough, fever, and upper respiratory, possibly lower respiratory tract infections. So I think that would be very helpful to promote that in our communities. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for appearing on our webinar and providing a frontline look at what's actually going on the ground these days to address the potential, not yet realized, for COVID-19 to hit the United States or Texas, and to thank all of the participants. Before everyone hangs up, though, I do want to take a few moments to just go through some recap matters. And so for those who are interested, just stay on, and I will attempt to share my screen. All right. There is a poll which you might see attached to the Zoom application. It just has 3 quick questions, and it gives us the opportunity to get feedback from our listeners as to what was useful. I kept the poll real short, so if people have supplemental comments that they want to make to me, my email address is schandler@uh.edu. I hate giving that out, but whatever. And just send me nice questions or comments about the webinar. We are honestly contemplating webinar 2 on the subject, and topics that we might want to address are international issues, immigration issues, discrimination issues. I think actually quite interestingly, insurance and financial issues that are caused, but I think it'll be a little while. I want to see what happens, whether that we in fact seem to get a phasing out of this disease and whether it really does peter out, or whether it starts to pop up in the Philippines and Cambodia, or whether China loses control of the matter. So but that's one point. Second, people have asked, but I asked questions and they didn't get answered, and I apologize for that. There's only a finite amount of time. We will try to get your answers posted in a supplemental communication to all participants. And that should go out, I will say, shortly. Finally, some people have asked about slides and recordings. The panelists who have willing to provide their slides, which I hope will be all of them, we will collect those and place them in a sensible place, give you links to them on email communications. And finally, we will also be providing you the link to a recording of this webinar so that you can relive every word in its glory. But thank you all for participating. This is our first webinar actually that we've held, and so I apologize for any technical glitches. I apologize for having a bronchial infection, which has left my voice a little hoarse, but I know I got a huge amount out of this. I thought all the panelists did a great job in providing distinct and important information. I hope you did as well. And I want to also thank my staff, April Moreno. I want to thank Professor Fowler and many others who contributed to the success. So thank you, and I will be terminating this.